The woman in the mirror was a ghost, and for 4 years, I had made sure of it. I stood in the master bathroom of our Upper East Side penthouse, a space dripping in Carrara marble and gold leaf fixtures, adjusting the hem of a navy dress I'd pulled from a clearance rack at a suburban Ross for $44. The fabric was thin, a synthetic blend that felt slightly scratchy against my skin, lacking the heavy, soulful drape of the Italian silk gowns hanging in the back of the closet, gowns Julian Thorne didn't know I owned. I remembered everything about the purchase of this dress. I remembered the fluorescent hum of the store, the smell of industrial cleaner, and most importantly, I remembered making sure Julian saw the crumpled receipt on the kitchen island. I had let out a staged, heavy sigh that evening, biting my lip as I looked at him. "I hope this is nice enough for your firm's big night, Julian," I had whispered, my voice practiced in its tremor. "I didn't want to overspend this month." He hadn't even looked up from his Bloomberg terminal. He just waved a dismissive hand, the gesture of a king swiping away a bothersome fly. "It's fine, Elara. Honestly, no one's going to be looking at you anyway. Just stay near the bar and try not to look too overwhelmed when the senior partners speak to you." That's the beauty of being invisible, I thought as I smoothed the fabric over my hips. People tell you the absolute, jagged truth because they've forgotten you have ears. I examined the woman staring back at me. She looked exhausted, her face devoid of the expensive fillers and high-end serums Julian's mistresses surely favored. Her hair was pulled back into a utilitarian ponytail, no professional blowout, no balayage highlights. Her shoes were scuffed heels from a discount outlet. She clipped coupons from the Sunday circulars. She bought the store-brand almond milk to save 80 cents. She drove a 12-year-old Toyota Corolla with a stubborn dent in the passenger door and a faint smell of old upholstery. She was exactly what Julian Thorne needed her to be. She was the charity project he could rescue to soothe his ego. She was the dull, muted background that made his brilliance shine brighter. She was also the most successful lie I had ever told. My legal name was Elara Vance. That much was true. But the struggling freelance writer persona, the woman who apologized for spending $30 on organic produce, the meek little thing who smiled and nodded while Julian's predatory friends talked over her at dinner parties, that was pure fiction. And if there was one thing I was world-class at, it was the art of narrative. Reality was a different beast entirely. I was the founder and chief executive officer of VC Ventures, a private equity powerhouse managing $6.4 billion in assets across 52 portfolio companies. The VC didn't stand for venture capital. It stood for my initials. It was a phantom empire, a labyrinthine ghost identity wrapped in layers of offshore entities, Delaware LLCs, and ironclad shell companies designed by the most expensive attorneys in the world. My lead attorney, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to ensure I remained a shadow, had filed my taxes separately from Julian's since the very first hour of our marriage. I had told Julian a carefully crafted story about a small inheritance from a distant aunt, maybe $250,000, and claimed I wanted to keep it separate for sentimental reasons. I could still hear his laughter echoing through the halls of our home when I told him. $250 grand, babe. I make that on a Tuesday bonus. Keep your little nest egg. It makes me feel better knowing you have a tiny safety net while I handle the real wealth. That was 4 years ago. August 12th, the day I became Mrs. Julian Thorne. The day I signed a prenuptial agreement he thought would be his shield against a gold digger. The day I walked into a cage of my own meticulous design and turned the key from the inside. I hadn't married Julian Thorne for the prestige of the Thorne name or the view from the penthouse. I had married him for a reckoning, and tonight, on our 4th anniversary, the trap was finally going to snap shut. I checked my phone, 6:45 p.m. The party was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. at the Celestial Terrace, a rooftop venue in Manhattan where the city lights sprawled out beneath you like a carpet of diamonds. Julian had chosen it, of course. He wanted to intimidate his colleagues from Vanguard and Sterling, the powerhouse investment bank where he was a senior vice president. He wanted to peacock. He wanted everyone to see how far the boy from nothing had climbed. What he didn't know What kept me warm during the cold nights in our shared bed was that I quietly owned 22% of Vanguard and Sterling. I had spent 3 years vacuuming up shares through 3 different anonymous holding companies, staying just a hair under the 25% disclosure threshold thaw. T would have alerted the board. I had been a ghost in his boardroom, a silent shadow in his quarterly earnings reports, a predator living in his guest room. He thought tonight was a celebration of his rise. He had no idea it was his public execution. I grabbed my purse, a faded knockoff I'd found at a thrift store, and headed for the door. Julian had left an hour earlier to oversee the logistics. In Julian speak, that meant he was already on his 3rd glass of 18-year-old Macallan, holding court with his investors, spinning tall tales about deals he'd closed and risks he'd conquered. He would be loud. He would be charismatic. He would be dangerously overconfident. That was when I would strike. As the elevator descended, the polished brass doors offered a final reflection of the charity case. The tired housewife, the dead-weight Julian, had been dragging behind him like an anchor for 4 long years. Let him think that. Let him believe I was small and broke and desperate for his approval. Let him stand up in front of 200 of New York's elite tonight and toast to 4 years of enduring a marriage to someone beneath him. Let him humiliate me. Because 7 years ago, I had stood in a cemetery in the pouring rain, staring at a grave that should have been empty, and I had made a silent promise to the woman I loved. I had sworn that the man responsible for her destruction would pay in a way that death could never satisfy. 4 years ago, I began that promise by saying, I do. Tonight, I was going to finish it by saying, I own you. The elevator doors slid open into the lobby. I stepped out into the humid Manhattan dusk, the skyline beginning to glow with an predatory orange hue. I felt an eerie, profound calm. There was no fear, no racing heart, only the quiet, cold certainty of a sniper who has had the target in her sights for 1,000 days. Julian Thorne thought he was the hunter. He thought he had married a woman who needed saving, a woman who was a rounding error in his grand design. He had no idea he had been sharing a bed with a shark. I slipped into my dented Corolla, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan, and steered toward the meatpacking district. I was heading toward the reckoning. I was heading toward the moment the perfect lie would finally shatter, and the truth would come for Julian Thorne like a freight train in the dark. The Celestial Terrace was a cathedral of glass and ego. As I stepped onto the rooftop, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, Chanel No. 5, and the electric hum of people who controlled the flow of the world's capital. The view of the Empire State Building was so close you could almost touch the spire. Waiters in white gloves moved like silent clockwork, offering trays of beluga caviar and vintage Krug. Julian was exactly where I expected him to be. At the center of a circle of Vanguard and Sterling board members, his face flushed with expensive scotch and the intoxicating high of his own voice. He looked impeccable in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, his hair slicked back with military precision. When he saw me approaching, he didn't offer a smile. He offered a look of weary tolerance. "Ah, there she is," Julian said, his voice carrying over the crowd. He didn't move toward me. He stayed in his circle, forcing me to walk to him. "Elara, you remember Marcus and Silas from the board." I offered a small, shy nod, playing my part to perfection. I clutched my thrift store purse to my chest and avoided direct eye contact. "Nice to see you again, sirs." Silas, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of old money and cynicism, gave me a cursory glance before turning back to Julian. "As you were saying, Julian, the restructuring of the Thorne Vanguard merger." I drifted to the periphery, a ghost in the room. I watched Julian drink. I watched him boast. I watched him dismiss me 3 more times when I tried to join a conversation. "Not now, Elara," he'd snap, his voice loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "This is adult talk. Why don't you go see if they have any of those little crab cakes you like?" The guests chuckled. The charity case was being put in her place. I waited. I watched the clock on the wall. 7:45 p.m. Julian was on his 4th drink. He was swaying just enough for a trained eye to notice. He was ready. He signaled to the waiter to kill the music. The room fell into a polite, expectant silence. Julian stepped onto a small raised platform, tapping the microphone with a heavy gold ring. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with a false warmth. "Thank you for joining me tonight. This evening marks 4 years of marriage to my lovely Elara." He gestured toward me, and a spotlight swung around, catching me in my $44 navy dress. I looked small, pale, and entirely out of place. I saw some of the socialites in the front row whispering behind their hands, likely mocking my lack of jewelry. "You know," Julian continued, smirk playing on his lips, "people often ask me why a man in my position married a woman like Elara. A woman who, quite frankly, doesn't know the difference between a hedge fund and a rose bush. A woman who still thinks a big investment is buying the generic brand of laundry detergent." The room erupted in a ripple of polite, cruel laughter. Julian leaned into the mic, his eyes glinting with a mean-spirited triumph. "I tell them the same thing every time. I've always been a fan of charity. Marrying Elara was the biggest philanthropic project of my life. She was a struggling writer who couldn't pay her rent when I met her. Now she lives in the Thorne penthouse and drives well, it's a car, I suppose." More laughter. Julian's boss, the CEO of Vanguard and Sterling, was grinning. Julian was on a roll, fueled by the scotch and the absolute belief that he was untouchable. "She's a freeloader, sure," Julian said, his tone mocking. "But she's my freeloader. Here's to 4 years of being the wind beneath my wings, even if you're a little too heavy to lift sometimes." He raised his glass. The room toasted. I stood there, the target of 100 pitying and mocking gazes. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. My heart didn't even skip a beat. Instead, I quietly set my glass of untouched ginger ale down on a nearby table. I looked Julian directly in the eye, and for the first time in 4 years, I let the mask slip just a fraction. I didn't look like a charity case anymore. I looked like a judge. I turned and walked toward the restroom, my scuffed heels clicking with a new, rhythmic authority. 10 minutes. That was all it would take. 10 minutes for the world Julian Thorne had built on the bones of others to begin its final, catastrophic collapse. As I entered the restroom, I didn't go to the mirror to fix my makeup. I pulled a secure, encrypted satellite phone from a hidden pocket in my $44 dress. I dialed a number that was burned into my memory. "It's time," I said, my voice cold and hard as a diamond. "Initiate the hostile takeover of Vanguard and Sterling. Liquidate all Thorne-associated accounts. And tell the FBI the witness is ready to testify." "Understood, Elara," a voice responded, the voice of my lead accountant. "The dominoes are falling as we speak." I hung up. I took a deep breath, smoothing the cheap navy fabric one last time. I looked at the woman in the restroom mirror. The ghost was gone. The predator had arrived. I walked back out into the party, straight to the front of the room, and before Julian could even put his glass down, I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. "Julian," I said, my voice amplified by the massive speakers, cutting through the murmurs like a scythe. "I think you're right. It is time for a change in our philanthropic strategy, but I think you have the roles reversed." The room went deathly silent. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and drunken irritation. "Elara, what the hell are you doing? Give me the mic." "No," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "I think I'll keep it, because for the next 10 minutes, Julian, you're going to listen. For the first time in 4 years, you're going to hear exactly who you've been living with." Julian reached for the mic, but I stepped back, my eyes flashing with a light that stopped him in his tracks. "Gentlemen of the board," I said, looking at the shocked men in the front row. "My name is Elara Vance, and as of 60 seconds ago, I am the majority shareholder of Vanguard and Sterling. And Julian, you're fired." Standing in that bathroom, the silence of the marble-clad walls felt like a vacuum, sucking the noise of the rooftop party away. I looked at the $44 navy dress again. To anyone else, it was a cheap garment, a symbol of a woman who had given up on herself. To me, it was a tactical uniform. It was the camouflage that had allowed me to infiltrate the Thorne family's inner sanctum without ever raising a single red flag. The world sees what it expects to see. Julian expected a broken, grateful waif, so that was the woman I gave him. I had spent 1,500 days curating a masterpiece of mediocrity. Every time I clipped a coupon for dish soap or complained about the price of gas, I was hammering another nail into the coffin of Julian's suspicion. A billionaire doesn't worry about the price of eggs. A billionaire doesn't drive a Corolla with a dented fender. But Elara Vance did. The duality of my existence was a constant, low-frequency hum in my brain. On one side was the freeloader, the woman who waited for Julian to give her a grocery allowance, like a child receiving pocket money. On the other was the ghost CEO of VC Ventures. While Julian was busy lording his senior VP title over waiters, I was overseeing the quiet acquisition of mid-sized tech firms in Silicon Alley and renewable energy plants in the Midwest. My empire was a phantom, a labyrinth of 52 portfolio companies woe. Then together through a series of Delaware LLCs and offshore trusts in the Caymans. I was a shadow in the global market, a whisper that moved billions without ever leaving a footprint. My lead attorney, Silas Vane, a man whose loyalty I had purchased with a 7-figure retainer, had filed my taxes separately from Julian's since the day of our nuptials. The lie about the small inheritance from an imaginary Aunt Clara had been the perfect bait. I remembered the day I'd proposed the separate filing, my voice soft and apologetic as we sat in his lawyer's high-rise office. It's just, Aunt Clara was very specific about the trust, Julian. To keep the $250,000 separate, I have to file my own returns. It's a legal technicality. I hope it's not too much trouble. Julian hadn't just agreed, he had mocked me for it. He'd leaned back in his leather chair, grinning at his lawyer. Did you hear that, Frank? She's worried about her little nest egg. Baby, I spend $250,000 on client dinners in a quarter. File however you want. I'm not exactly worried about you stealing my thunder. He'd signed the amendment without reading the fine print. That was the first mistake. He thought he was protecting his millions from a gold digger. He had no idea he was giving me the legal cover to hide a multi-billion-dollar empire right under his nose. But the plan hadn't started with Julian. To truly dismantle a man like him, I had to understand the soil he grew from. That meant I had to face the source of his arrogance, Beatrice Thorne. October 2020. The drive to Scarsdale was silent, save for the hum of Julian's Tesla. The landscape changed from the jagged concrete of the city to the manicured, oppressive perfection of old money Westchester. My mother is particular, Elara, Julian warned, his eyes fixed on the road. She's been the queen of the Scarsdale social scene for 40 years. Just smile, agree with her, and try not to mention that you shop at Target. She has a literal allergy to the middle class. I understand, Julian, I said, tucking a stray hair behind my ear. I'll be on my best behavior. The Thorne estate was a sprawling Victorian, a monument to old money and even older secrets. The lawn was trimmed with surgical precision, and the hedges were shaped into green walls that felt more like a fortress than a garden. Beatrice Thorne didn't wait for us to ring the bell. She appeared in the foyer the moment the car door closed, standing like a silver-haired sentinel. She was 68 then, tall and dangerously thin in that way rich women achieve through a lifetime of salads and dissatisfaction. Her pearls were heavy and unmistakably real. Her smile was sharp and unmistakably fake. She scanned me from head to toe, her eyes moving with the cold efficiency of a jeweler appraising a piece of cubic zirconia. So this is the one, Beatrice said. She didn't address me. She addressed Julian as if I were a piece of furniture he'd picked up at an estate sale. Mom, this is Elara, Julian said, his voice brimming with a performative pride. He draped an arm around my shoulder, but it didn't feel like an embrace. It felt like he was claiming ownership of a prize. Beatrice extended 2 fingers for a handshake. I took them gingerly. Her skin felt like cold parchment. I suppose congratulations are in order, she said, her tone suggesting she was actually mourning a loss. Dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. We sat in a dining room that smelled of lemon wax and ancient dust. Julian sat at one end of the long mahogany table, Beatrice at the other. I was positioned in the middle, feeling like a defendant in a high-stakes trial. The meal was a meticulously catered roast, asparagus, fingerling potatoes, and a chicken that tasted like nothing. I complimented the decor. Beatrice ignored me. I complimented the food. Beatrice took a sip of her wine. It wasn't until the dessert, a tart lemon sorbet, that she finally acknowledged my existence. "So, Elara, dear," Beatrice said, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin that probably cost more than my dress. "Julian tells me you're a writer. How? Quaint." "I enjoy it," I said softly, keeping my eyes downcast. "I do freelance work mostly, essays, small articles." "And does it pay?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Or is it more of a hobby, a way to pass the time while my son provides for your lifestyle?" The air in the room went still. Julian didn't even look up from his sorbet. He didn't defend me. He just let the silence hang there, enjoying the spectacle of my humiliation. "Julian has a soft heart," Beatrice continued, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "He's always had a tendency to rescue things. Stray cats, broken toys, struggling artists. You're quite lucky he looked twice at you, dear. Most men in his position wouldn't have bothered." I forced a small, tremulous smile. "I know, I'm very grateful to him." "Good, you should." Beatrice stood up, signaling the end of the meal. "Now, be a dear and help the staff clear the table. Julian and I have some family business to discuss in the library." And just like that, I was dismissed, sent to the kitchen like the help. I stood at the sink, scraping uneaten roast into the trash and loading the heavy dishwasher while Julian's laughter drifted through the walls from the library. He was at ease here, in the kingdom his mother had built. I stood with my hands in soapy water, feeling the cold weight of the last 4 years. But I wasn't hurt. I wasn't crying. I was taking notes. Before we left that night, I noticed something. Beatrice had asked me what my name was 3 separate times during the course of the evening. Each time, Julian had corrected her with a gentle, patronizing laugh. Each time, Beatrice had looked confused for a fleeting second, a shadow passing over her eyes, before the mask of the Thorne matriarch snapped back into place. The information slid off her brain like water off glass. Early signs, memory lapses, repetitive questioning. I filed it away. Julian hadn't noticed. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the foyer mirror. He didn't see the cracks in his mother's foundation, but I did, and I knew exactly how to use them. Over the next year, I became the daughter-in-law Beatrice Thorne never wanted, but suddenly couldn't live without. While Julian was busy chasing whale investors at Manhattan steakhouses and spending his weekends on golf courses in the Hamptons, I was in Scarsdale. I brought her groceries from the high-end markets she liked. I spent hours in her garden, listening to her talk about the social triumphs of 1984. I sat in her drawing room and listened to stories about Julian's father, a man who had apparently been as cold and calculating as his son. She never remembered my name for more than an hour, but she grew to tolerate my presence because I was useful. I was the meek little thing who didn't mind her barbs. I was the one who helped her find her keys when she forgot where she'd put them for the 5th time that morning. Julian visited her maybe twice a year, usually when he needed her to co-sign a loan or when he wanted to show off a new watch. He saw his mother as an indestructible monument of Thorne power. He didn't see the woman who was slowly losing the thread of her own life. I documented everything. Every lapse, every forgotten appointment, every time she asked me who I was. The diagnosis was unmistakable, early-stage Alzheimer's. By the time 2021 rolled around, the trap was ready. I suggested Beatrice see a specialist, a neurologist I'd vetted through my own private channels. Julian, of course, was too busy to take her, so I did. In a quiet office in Westchester, Dr. Sterling confirmed my suspicions. Beatrice Thorne was slipping. "She still has legal capacity," the doctor told me privately, "but that window is closing. If there are legal or financial arrangements that need to be made, now is the time." I didn't tell Julian. Instead, I sat with Beatrice in her garden that afternoon. Beatrice, I said, my voice gentle and full of feigned concern. I'm worried. Julian. He's been talking a lot lately about consolidating your assets. He says it would be easier if he managed your accounts directly. Beatrice's head snapped up. Her eyes, usually clouded with confusion, suddenly sharpened with an old, familiar spark of suspicion. He said that. He's just worried about you, I lied. But I know how much this house and your independence mean to you. I wouldn't want to see you lose control of what you've built. He's always been greedy, Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. Just like his father, he thinks I'm weak. I know an attorney, I said. A specialist in estate protection. We could set up a trust, an irrevocable one. It would ensure that your house, your pension, and your investments stay exactly where they are. Julian wouldn't be able to touch them without your permission. Or mine, if you want me to help you manage it. Beatrice looked at me. For the first time in years, she didn't look at me like dirt on her shoe. She looked at me as an ally. I'd trust you with my life before I'd trust Julian with $1, she said. In August 2020, just days after our wedding, Beatrice Thorne signed the documents. An irrevocable trust. A power of attorney for health care and finances. All of it named me, Elara Vance, as the primary trustee. Julian had no idea. He thought his mother's $4 million estate was his ultimate safety net, the Thorne fund he could tap into if his gambling or his bad deals ever caught up with him. He had no idea I had already moved the keys to the kingdom to my own pocket. As I drove back from Scarsdale that day, I looked at the dented Corolla's dashboard. The mask was working. The Freeloader was now the guardian of the Thorne legacy. But Beatrice was just one bar of the cage. To truly destroy Julian, I needed to show the world the monster he was in his professional life. I needed to let him build his own gallows, one fraudulent charity gala at a time. The rain at Woodlawn Cemetery was a cold, needles-sharp drizzle that soaked through my wool coat and settled into my marrow. It was April 2017, the grayest spring I had ever known. The sky was a bruised charcoal, and the sprawling oaks of the Bronx stood like skeletal sentinels over the weathered headstones. I stood apart from the small cluster of mourners, my eyes fixed on the pale oak casket draped in white lilies. The pastor was saying something about God's plan and eternal rest, his voice a rhythmic drone that felt like an insult to the lightning bolt brilliance of the woman inside that box. Maya Brooks was 26 years old. She had been my best friend since the 3rd grade, my roommate at Northwestern, the sister I had chosen for myself. She was the kind of brilliant that made people uncomfortable, the kind that MIT sought out for a Master S in computational finance before she'd even finished her undergrad. Maya didn't just see numbers, she saw the heartbeat of the global market. She had spent 2 years of her life breathing life into a proprietary trading algorithm for her thesis, a piece of code so elegant and predatory that investment firms were circling her like sharks before she had even walked across the stage at graduation. In 2015, Julian Thorne had personally recruited her to Vanguard and Sterling. He'd used that practiced, predatory charm of his, the easy smile, the promise of a seat at the table where the world's future was decided. Maya was ambitious, hungry to prove herself in a world dominated by men like Julian. 6 months later, he stole it. He didn't just tweak her algorithm, he stripped it of her name, presented it to the Vanguard and Sterling partners as his own breakthrough, and collected a $1.2 million bonus for innovation. When Maya tried to fight back, when she marched into his office with the logs and the original code, Julian didn't flinch. He sat behind his mahogany desk, leaned back, and threatened to report her to the SEC for insider trading, a crime she hadn't committed, but one she couldn't afford to defend herself against. Then came the gaslighting. He convinced the partners that Maya was unstable, that the pressure of the high-frequency trading desk had fractured her psyche. He seeded rumors that her work was riddled with errors he'd had to fix. They fired her in January 2016. Maya couldn't find another job. Every firm she applied to called Vanguard and Sterling for a reference. Every firm heard the same poison, brilliant but a liability, mentally fragile. On March 15, 2017, Maya Brooks walked onto the Manhattan Bridge at 2 in the morning and didn't come back. As the first shovel of dirt hit the casket, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see a man I hadn't seen in years. He was tall, lean, with the same sharp cheekbones and piercing, serious eyes as Maya. "You're Elara," he said softly. His voice was a rasp, his eyes rimmed with the kind of red that only comes from days of silent screaming. "Caleb," I whispered, Maya's brother. He'd been living in Boston, making a name for himself in private equity. He hadn't been around when everything fell apart. "I know what happened, Elara," Caleb said, his gaze shifting to the fresh grave. "Maya told me everything in those last weeks. Julian Thorne killed her just as surely as if he'd pushed her over that railing himself." "I know," I said, my voice as cold as the rain. "Then help me make him pay," Caleb said. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wet dirt. "I don't want a lawsuit. I don't want a settlement. I want him ruined. I want him in a cage. I want the world to see the hollow, pathetic thief he really is." I didn't hesitate. I didn't even blink. "Then we can't just sue him, Caleb. A civil suit is a slap on the wrist for a man like Julian. He'd settle, pay the fine with a rounding error from his bonus, and move on to the next victim. If we want him destroyed, we need to build a federal case, something he can't buy his way out of." Caleb turned to me then, his jaw tight. "What kind of case?" "RICO," I said. "Racketeering. It was designed to take down the mob, but it works perfectly for corporate fraud. The key is proving a pattern of criminal activity over a long period. One theft, Maya's algorithm, isn't enough to trigger the heavy penalties. We need to show that he's been doing this for years to multiple victims. We need to document a systematic empire of betrayal." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, the rain dripping off the brim of his hat. "How long will that take? Years?" "Maybe 7, I said. "Maybe more. The FBI will need an airtight trail. We'll need to document every crime, every victim, every dollar he embezzles. We'll have to let him keep committing crimes so we have enough evidence to bury him." "You want me to watch him hurt more people and do N?" "Thing." Caleb's voice was a low growl. "I want you to document it," I corrected. "I want you to get so close to him that he trusts you more than he trusts his own shadow. I want you to be the one who hands him the shovel every time he digs his own grave. And when the time comes, we'll use that trust to shatter him." Caleb stared at the grave for a long, heavy minute. Then he held out his hand. 7 years, but when the day comes, I want to be in the room when the lights go out." We shook on it, right there over Maya's fresh grave. That was the moment the charity case was born. Standing in the rain, we mapped out the architecture of the next decade. Caleb would move back to New York. He would infiltrate Julian's world, bond with him over high-stakes deals, and become his confidant inside Vanguard and Sterling. I would handle the financial trap from the outside. I would build my own empire, VC Ventures, in the shadows, using my inheritance and my own market savvy to create the cage Julian would eventually step into. But there was one piece missing, a piece that made Caleb's blood run cold when I suggested it. "I need to marry him," I said. Caleb looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "You what? Elara, no, that's too much. You can't live with that monster." "It's the only way this works," I argued, my voice devoid of emotion. "Think about it, Caleb. 1, I need a legal reason to file my taxes separately so I can hide my assets and my business. 2, I need a prenup with a fraud penalty clause that only triggers if he commits crimes during the marriage. 3, I need total access to his home, his personal files, his mother's estate. And 4, the FBI needs a wife cooperating with a federal investigation. That's the golden ticket for long-term surveillance warrants." "How long?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking. 4 years, I said. "The charity fraud alone will take 2 years to fully develop. He has to launch the fund, collect the donations, and fail to deliver the scholarships. We can't rush the timeline. We need the forensic accounting to be indisputable." Caleb was silent for a long time. Then he sighed, a sound of profound defeat. "That's a hell of a sacrifice, Elara, to wake up next to him every day knowing what he did." "It's not a sacrifice if it works," I said, looking at Maya's headstone. "She deserves more than a memorial service. She deserves to know that Julian Thorne spent the rest of his miserable life in a federal penitentiary. And if he suspects me, Caleb, I'll be ready. A year later, in May 2018, Caleb accidentally met Julian at a private equity networking event in the Hamptons. They bonded over a mutual love of high-risk shorts and expensive whiskey. By 2019, they were inseparable. Julian considered Caleb his brother in arms, his most trusted advisor. When I married Julian in August 2020, Caleb was the best man. Julian never knew Maya Brooks had a brother. She'd only worked at Vanguard for 14 months, and Julian had been so focused on burying her that he'd never bothered to look into her family history. By the time Caleb moved to New York in 2018, Julian had already scrubbed Maya from his memory like a smudge on a window. But we hadn't forgotten. For 7 years, we built the cage around him, one steel bar at a time. Caleb provided the intelligence from inside the bank. I provided the financial pressure from the outside. By early 2024, the evidence was nearly complete. But we needed a catalyst, something to make Julian desperate enough to confess his darkest secrets on a recorded line. Julian was a prideful man. He wouldn't admit to a crime unless he thought it was the only way to secure a massive win. That was when I invented Hans von Kessler. June 2023. I sat in my home office on a Wednesday morning, the door locked, the shades drawn. I had a high-end headset on, my laptop open to a complex suite of VoIP software. It was 10:47 a.m. Julian was at the Vanguard and Sterling offices on Wall Street. Caleb had texted me 15 minutes ago to confirm Julian was at his desk. Manhattan was 5 miles away, but from the safety of my struggling writer office, it felt like I was operating a drone over enemy territory. Julian had no idea that the woman he thought was busy writing a blog post about the joy of thrifting was about to become a Swiss billionaire. I had spent 18 months building Hans von Kessler. He wasn't just a name, he was a legend. It had started with the website, Von Kessler Capital, CH. It was a masterpiece of minimalist, old money design, the kind of site that didn't need to shout because it controlled the room. I'd hired a Zurich-based web developer, paid him through 3 different shell companies, and hosted the site on secure Swiss servers. The site featured a portfolio of select investments, all fabricated, but grounded in plausible reality. Tech startups in Singapore, renewable energy projects in the Bavarian Alps, luxury hotel chains in Dubai. I created fake performa. NCE reports showing consistent 22% annual returns from 2015 to 2023. Hans wasn't a gambler, he was a strategist. Then came the media presence. I paid for native advertising, sponsored content that looked like editorial pieces in the Financial Times and Bloomberg. Short, enigmatic profiles. Hans von Kessler, the private equity titan you've never heard of. How one Swiss investor made billions staying off the radar. The kind of articles that made Hans sound exclusive, elusive, and unimaginably rich. I even built the physical infrastructure. I rented a serviced office at Paradeplatz 8, right in the heart of Zurich's financial district. The office came with a receptionist named Anna who worked for the building management and had no idea she was part of an elaborate sting. If Julian's assistant called to verify Von Kessler Capital's address, Anna would answer. Von Kessler Capital AG. How may I direct your call? I bought a LinkedIn profile with 500 connections, aged accounts I'd purchased on the dark web, and had them endorse Hans for venture capital and strategic investments. I used AI to generate a headshot, a silver-haired man in his 60s with a navy suit and a look of dignified boredom. The final piece was the voice. I'd hired a Swiss voice actor to record hours of phrases, then used AI voice synthesis software to create a deepfake model. With a 2-second latency, I could type responses in real time, and the software would speak them in Hans's gravelly, authoritative Zurich accent. The whole operation cost me $250,000. For most people, that was a life-changing amount of money. For me, it was the best investment I'd ever made. On June 15th, I made the first call. I routed it through a VoIP server in New York, a one-party consent state, so I could legally record every word without Julian's knowledge. I pressed call and waited. 3 rings, then Julian's voice, smooth and arrogant. Julian Thorne. I typed into the text box on my screen. The AI spoke instantly. Mr. Thorne, this is Hans von Kessler calling from Zurich. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. There was a pause. I could almost hear Julian's brain working, scanning his mental database for the name. Zurich, von Kessler, Billionaire. Not at all, Mr. von Kessler, Julian said, his tone shifting into his VVIP gear. What can I do for you? I've been following your work at Vanguard and Sterling with great interest, I typed. The AI voice was perfect, the subtle lilt of the German accent, the cold professional distance. I'm looking to deploy $50 million into a high-growth partner in the U.S. market. Your colleague, Caleb Brooks, spoke very highly of your discretion. Another pause. Julian's breathing hitched. 50 million. I appreciate the referral, Julian said carefully. Caleb is a good man, but I have to be honest, I don't usually take calls without a video conference first. How do I know you're who you say you are? I'd been waiting for this. Mr. Thorne, I understand your caution, but you should know that I value privacy above all else. My clients include sovereign wealth funds and family offices that demand absolute anonymity. I don't do video conferences. I don't meet new partners until after the first 50 million is deployed. If that's not acceptable, I have a waiting list of other investors. The scarcity play, the exclusivity angle. I knew Julian's psyche better than he knew himself. He couldn't stand the idea of being left out. Let me talk to Caleb, Julian said. I'll get back to you. Of course, but Julian, this line is encrypted. Nobody else is listening. In our world, discretion is everything. I hung up. 20 minutes later, Caleb texted me. He's calling. Hook, line, and sinker. Phase 2 had begun. Julian was about to walk into a ghost's trap, and he was going to do it with a smile on his face. Julian Thorne met Caleb Brooks for lunch that afternoon at Delmonico's, a midtown institution where the walls were mahogany, and the air was thick with the scent of medium-rare steaks and industrial-strength perfume. Julian sat in a leather booth, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm on the white tablecloth. He had already finished one dirty martini before Caleb even walked through the door. He called me Caleb, Julian whispered the moment Caleb sat down. Hans von Kessler, the man actually called my private line. Caleb played his part with the practiced ease of a Shakespearean actor. He offered a slow, knowing smile. I told you he would, Julian. Hans is a man of his word, but he's selective. If he's talking to you, it's because he thinks you're the smartest predator in the Manhattan jungle. He wants to deploy 50 million, Julian said, his eyes glittering with a feverish, hungry light. But he's cagey. No video, no in-person meetings. He's obsessive about privacy. That's the Zurich way, Caleb said, leaning in. Old money doesn't peacock, Julian. It moves in the dark. I flew to Zurich last month, met team at Paradeplatz. The office was minimalist, high security, and dripping in quiet wealth. He's the real deal. He manages over $6 billion for families you and I aren't even allowed to name. If you secure this partnership, you won't just be an SVP at Vanguard and Sterling. You'll be a god. Julian leaned back, a look of profound satisfaction washing over his face. 50 million, that would solve everything. What Julian didn't say, what he couldn't admit to Caleb or even to his own reflection, was that he was drowning. I had been tracking his financial hemorrhage for 3 years through a private investigator I'd hired under a VC Ventures shell company. Julian Thorne was a functioning degenerate. He owed over $4 million to offshore sportsbooks in Antigua and high-stakes casinos in Las Vegas. He had been borrowing against his future bonuses for years, shifting numbers in his personal accounts like a high-speed shell game. He was desperate for a lifeline, and Hans von Kessler was offering him a golden ladder out of the pit. While Julian was chasing the Swiss ghost, I was busy documenting his most public betrayal, the Thorne Scholars Fund. Julian had launched the 501(c)(3) nonprofit in late 2020, just months after our wedding. On paper, It was a visionary commitment to changing lives through education. Dee stood on a stage at the Waldorf Astoria in a custom tuxedo, his voice warm and humble, promising to send 250 underprivileged kids to Ivy League schools on full-ride scholarships. "Every child deserves a chance," Julian had told the teary-eyed audience of donors. "I grew up with every advantage, and it's my moral obligation to break the cycles of poverty in this city. The Thorne Scholars Fund isn't just a charity, it's a promise of a better future." Standing ovation. The applause was thunderous. The donations poured in $12 million in the first 2 years. I stood backstage that night, a supportive wife in a dress I'd told him was from a consignment shop, smiling for the cameras. But inside, I was doing the math. I'd hired a forensic accountant, a man I paid under the table through a series of untraceable wire transfers, to track every penny that flowed through the fund. What he found was a masterclass in professional theft. 95% of the donations to the Thorne Scholars Fund went to administrative costs. That was Julian's euphemism for the elaborate infrastructure of fraud. The money was funneled into offshore consulting firms with names like Global Educational Management LLC and Apex Student Services, all of which were registered in the British Virgin Islands and controlled by Julian. Only 5% went to actual program expenses, token donations to local YMCAs and community centers to make the books look legitimate if anyone glanced at them. But no one glanced. Julian was a thorn. He was a senior VP at Vanguard and Sterling. He was untouchable. By late 2023, the fund had raised over $14 million. The number of scholarships awarded to actual students was 0. I began building a file. It wasn't just bank statements and wire transfer records, it was human stories. I needed faces for the jury to see. That was when I found Alina Rodriguez. Alina was 19, a senior at a public high school in the Bronx when Julian's team reached out to her in the spring of 2022. She was brilliant, a 4 GPA, perfect SAT scores, accepted to Columbia for biomedical engineering. Her guidance counselor had been ecstatic. Julian Thorne himself had shown up at her school, gave a rousing speech about the brilliance of the Bronx, and handed Alina a certificate in front of the entire student body. $350,000, Julian had whispered to her as the cameras flashed. "Full ride. Your life starts today, Alina." Alina's mother, a woman who worked 2 cleaning jobs to support her daughter, had wept. They'd celebrated. They believed their nightmare of poverty was over. Then Alina showed up at Columbia in August 2022 for orientation. The financial aid office had no record of the Thorne scholarship. No payment. No communication. Nothing. Alina's mother had called Julian's office 22 times. She'd left voicemails, sent emails, even tried to wait in the lobby of Vanguard and Sterling until security threw her out. They had 48 hours to cover the tuition or Alina would lose her spot. Her mother sold their only car. They borrowed $60,000 from relatives and predatory lenders. Alina took out $90,000 in high-interest student loans just to survive her freshman year. When Alina's mother finally emailed me, finding my contact info through a defunct charity board I was supposedly on, her message was a jagged shard of glass. "Mr. Thorne destroyed my daughter's future. He looked us in the eye and lied while he stole the money meant to save her. We are in debt we will never escape." I sat in my home office, staring at that email, and felt a cold fire ignite in my chest. Julian wasn't Juice. A thief. He was a predator who hunted the hopeful. He looked teenagers in the eye, promised them a world of light, and then turned the lights out the moment he walked out the door. I added Alina to the list. By the end of 2023, I had found 53 other families in the exact same situation. Kids whose futures were derailed because Julian Thorne wanted to feel like a philanthropist without actually being one. January 2021. The first time I walked into the FBI field office on Federal Plaza, I felt like a ghost trying to materialize. I sat in a sterile waiting room for an hour before a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, no-nonsense eyes led me into a small conference room. I'm Special Agent Sarah Reynolds, she said, setting a yellow legal pad on the table. You said you have information regarding Thorne Vanguard and Julian Thorne. I didn't lead with my billions. I didn't lead with my secret identity. I led with Julian's bloodlust for money and the trail of broken children he was leaving behind. I laid out the Thorne Scholars Fund plan, the offshore accounts, and the systematic fraud. Reynolds listened without interrupting for 20 minutes. When I finished, she studied me for a long moment, her pen hovering over her pad. How long have you been planning this? She asked. Since the day my best friend died because of him, I said, my voice steady. I want a RICO case, Agent Reynolds. I want him in federal prison for 20 years. I want asset forfeiture. I want him to lose every cent, every suit, and every friend he's ever had. Reynolds leaned back, a small, professional smile playing on her lips. RICO requires a pattern of racketeering activity. We need to prove he's been doing this systematically for years. One crime isn't enough. I can give you 7 years, I said. I have a man on the inside and I'm his wife. I can give you everything. Reynolds opened a case file that day. By March, she'd secured a Title III wiretap warrant from the U.S. District Court. Under federal law, Title III allows the interception of oral communications if there's probable cause a crime is being committed. Caleb started wearing a wire in April 2021. Every lunch with Julian, every golf outing, every late-night drink was recorded under federal authority. Every phone call Julian made from his office at Vanguard and Sterling was monitored. And every call I made, as Hans von Kessler was captured under that same warrant. By January 2024, I had a file 3 inches thick. I had the recordings. I had the wire transfers. I had the testimony of the families Julian had destroyed. But I needed the killing blow. I needed Julian to move client money, not just charity money, into the von Kessler trap. January 2024. I sat in my office, the Hans von Kessler software ready. Julian, I typed, the AI speaking in Hans's gravelly voice. I'm prepared to wire the $50 million next month, but I need to see your nerve. I'm considering a $100 million stake now, but my board in Zurich is nervous about your conventional returns at Vanguard. I can show you more, Julian's voice crackled through the speakers. He was in his office, the door locked. I have off-book opportunities, Hans, private placement deals that I manage personally, high yield, high discretion. I need proof, Hans said. I don't move a cent without seeing how you handle large-scale capital off the books. I've already moved $8 million, Julian said. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. I shifted it from 3 major client accounts this morning into a private placement vehicle I control. It's a bridge loan for a tech acquisition. It'll be back in their accounts by the time they see their quarterly statements with a 20% gain. I can show you the wire logs. I felt my breath hitch. There it was, embezzlement, securities fraud, wire fraud. I'm impressed, Julian, Hans said. Send me the logs. If the structure is sound, we'll move the $100 million by the end of the month. I'll send them now, Julian said, his voice thick with the high of his own perceived brilliance. This is just the beginning, Hans. Together, we're going to own this city. I hung up the call. Within 5 minutes, the wire logs appeared in Hans's encrypted inbox. Julian had just handed me the smoking gun, signed, sealed, and delivered. I forwarded the files to Agent Reynolds within seconds. We have him, I whispered to the empty room. I met Reynolds at a nondescript diner in Queens that afternoon. I slid a USB drive across the table. 18 months of Hans von Kessler recordings, I said. 3 years of Caleb's wire logs, the embezzlement of $8 million in client funds, the scholarship fraud, the tax evasion, everything you need for the RICO indictment. Reynolds picked up the drive, her eyes gleaming. This is the most meticulous civilian-led investigation I've seen in 20 years. When do you want us to move? August 12th, I said, our 4th wedding in. Niversary. He's throwing a massive party at the Celestial Terrace. All his investors, his board, the city's elite, They'll all be there. You want to do it in front of everyone? Reynolds asked. I want him to feel safe first, I said. I want him to stand on that stage and tell the world how successful he is. And then I want him to watch it all turn to ash while the cameras are still rolling. Reynolds nodded. August 12th, we'll be ready. As I walked out of the diner, the Manhattan skyline looked different. It didn't look like Julian's kingdom anymore. It looked like a graveyard, and I was finally ready to put the last of the Thorne legacy to rest. But there was one final task before the anniversary. I had to secure the final piece of the financial trap. I had to reveal the ghost in the machine to the people Julian feared most, his own board of directors. The atmosphere in the Thorne penthouse had shifted from a cold, silent truce to a vibrating, high-voltage tension. Julian was no longer just arrogant. He was becoming erratic. The scotch bottles in the library were being replaced every 3 days, and the light under his office door stayed on until 4 in the morning. To the world, he was the senior VP of Vanguard and Sterling, the man with the Midas touch. To me, the woman he thought was a rounding error in his life. He was a wounded animal frantically trying to find a way out of a forest fire. I was sitting in my writing nook, a small, cramped corner of the second-floor landing, when the front door slammed with a violence that rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Elara. Julian's voice was a jagged saw, cutting through the quiet of the afternoon. I didn't rush to meet him. I waited, counting to 10, keeping my breathing steady. I pulled my faded cardigan tighter around my shoulders, smoothing my hair into its customary, limp ponytail. I looked like a woman who was afraid of a loud noise. I looked like a victim. Julian stormed into the room, his face a mottled, angry purple. His silk tie was loosened, hanging like a noose around his neck. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled stack of legal documents. You want to tell me what the hell this is? He roared, throwing the papers at my feet. I just tried to wire $200,000 from my mother's account to cover a business liquidity issue, and the bank told me the account is locked. They said it's part of a trust, an irrevocable trust. I looked down at the papers, feigning a look of mild, confused surprise. A trust? Oh, Julian, I didn't realize you didn't know. Didn't know what? He stepped into my space, his breath smelling of expensive gin and desperation. The bank said the primary trustee is Elara Vance. That's you. Why is your name on my mother's money? I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes wide and watery. Your mother! She asked me to help her, Julian, back in 2020. She was so worried about her finances. She said you'd been asking her to co-sign loans for your ventures, and she was terrified of losing the house in Scarsdale. She wanted to make sure she was protected. Julian's eyes widened. He looked like I'd just slapped him with a wet fish. Protected? From me, I'm her son. She knew about the gambling, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. She'd seen the credit card statements you'd left in her guest room. She knew about the casino markers. She didn't want to end up in a state-run facility because her son couldn't stop betting on the Knicks. You manipulated her, Julian screamed, his hand catching the edge of my writing desk, nearly upending it. She had dementia even then. You took advantage of a sick old woman to steal my inheritance. This was the moment. The first time in 4 years I stopped playing the waif and started showing him the steal. She had early-stage Alzheimer. Yes, I said, my voice suddenly calm, cold, and devoid of its usual tremor. And because of that, we had her evaluated by Dr. Sterling, the top neurologist in Westchester. He certified that she had full legal capacity when she signed those documents. She was represented by Margaret Campbell, a lawyer who has spent 30 years protecting the estates of New York's elite. Margaret made sure Beatrice understood every single word. There is a video of the signing, Julian. Your mother looks directly at the camera and says, I'm doing this because I don't trust my son with $1. Julian staggered back, his face draining of color. The papers on the floor seemed to glow with his defeat. I'll sue, he whispered, though the bravado was gone. I'll have it overturned. I'll prove you coerced her. Go ahead, I said, shrugging as if it were of no consequence. Margaret Campbell is waiting for your call. She's already prepared the defense. But you should know, Julian, that trust is ironclad. It's irrevocable. Not even a Supreme Court justice could crack it. Every cent of your mother's $4 million estate is locked away for her care. I pay her bills. I pay for her nurses. I pay for her Sunrise facility. You can't touch it. Not for a business deal, not for a casino debt, and certainly not to buy another custom tuxedo. Julian stared at me. It was the first time he really looked at me in years, not as a freeloader, but as a threat. But his ego was still too bloated to see the full scope of the trap. You think you've won something? He spat, his voice trembling with rage. Fine, keep the Scarsdale money. I'm a senior VP at Vanguard and Sterling. I make more in a year than that estate is worth. I don't need my mother's crumbs. I have von Kessler coming through with $100 million. I'm going to be bigger than this whole family ever was. Of course you are, Julian, I said, the freeloader mask slipping back into place like a well-oiled gear. I'm sure it'll all work out. I was just doing what your mother asked. He stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard a framed photo of our wedding day fell off the hallway table, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds. I didn't pick it up. I just smiled. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his mother's estate was only a tiny fraction of the financial guillotine I had built. While he was focused on Beatrice's $4 million, I was busy buying his life. Over the past 3 years, VC Ventures had been operating as a vulture debt collection agency in the shadows. I had used a series of shell companies to track every single debt Julian Thorne had ever incurred. Julian was a man of expensive tastes and even more expensive secrets. When his gambling debts to the offshore sportsbooks in Antigua reached a critical mass, I bought the notes. When he took out high-interest personal loans from private lenders in Jersey to cover his losses in 2022, I bought those, too. I bought his credit card debt. I bought the secondary mortgage he'd quietly taken out on our vacation home in the Hamptons. By March 2024, Julian Thorne owed $28 million to various creditors across the globe. And VC Ventures owned every single penny of it. I had purchased his debt for roughly 40 cents on the dollar, a total investment of $11.2 million. To the original lenders, Julian was a high-risk liability they were happy to offload. To me, he was a man who had unknowingly signed over his soul to his wife. As the owner of his debt, I had the legal right to demand immediate repayment if he defaulted on a single installment. I had the right to garnish his wages. I had the right to seize any asset that wasn't protected by a trust, his car, his watches, his equity in Vanguard and Sterling. He was bankrupt. He just hadn't seen the balance sheet yet. February 2024. The final piece of the trap required Julian to show the world the depth of his cowardice. Caleb and I had spent months discussing how Julian would react when the walls finally closed in. Julian was a man who feared 2 things above all else: prison and public humiliation. He'll look for an out, Caleb had said during one of our clandestine meetings in a rainy Central Park. Julian doesn't do accountability. If he thinks he's going to be perp-walked out of Vanguard, he'll try to play the martyr. He'll look for a way to escape without actually facing the music. We need to know what that escape looks like, I said, before it happens. With Caleb's help, I'd had a state-of-the-art hidden camera installed in Julian's private office at Vanguard and Sterling. It was tucked into a smoke detector, nearly invisible, with a wide-angle lens that captured the entire room. The feed was encrypted and streamed directly to a secure server at VC Ventures. On the night of February 18th, I was sitting in my office in the Willis Tower, watching the feed. It was 11:47 p.m. The Vanguard building was nearly empty, the cleaning crews long gone. Julian was alone in his office. He wasn't working. He was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering lights of the financial district. He looked small against the vastness of the city. Then, he did something that made my blood run cold. Julian reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a black semi-automatic pistol, a Smith & Wesson M&P9. He held it with a practiced, unsettling familiarity. He walked over to the darkened glass of the window, using his reflection as a mirror. He raised the gun to his temple. I felt a surge of panic, not for him but for the plan. He can't die yet, not before the reckoning. But Julian wasn't pulling the trigger. He was practicing. "Okay, here's the move," I heard Julian's voice through the high-sensitivity mic. He was talking to his reflection, his voice eerie and detached. "I say, I'd rather die than lose everything." Then I point the gun. Everyone panics. The feds, the board, they all freeze. In the chaos, I can get to the private elevator. Caleb will have the car waiting. It's theater. It's just theater. He adjusted his grip on the weapon. He pracked. Iced the angle of his head. He tried out different facial expressions. Anguish, desperation, a stoic, tragic resolve. "I'd rather die than lose everything," he repeated, testing the inflection. No, more breathy, "I'd rather die than lose everything." He checked his watch, timing the dramatic beat. He did it 3 more times, a director perfecting a scene in a high-stakes play. He wasn't planning on killing himself. He was planning a fake suicide attempt to create a distraction for his escape when the FBI eventually moved in. I sat back in my chair, a feeling of profound disgust washing over me. Even his despair was a fraud. Even his final act of desperation was a choreographed lie. "You pathetic coward," I whispered to the screen. I didn't call the police. I called Caleb. "He's practicing a fake suicide," I told him, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and satisfaction. "He has a Smith & Wesson in his desk. He's going to use it as a distraction when the feds arrive." "I know," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I saw him buy it through a back-channel contact last month. Don't worry, Elara, I've already handled it." "Handled it how?" "I have the key to his office," Caleb said. "I went in last night while he was at dinner. I swapped the live ammunition for dummy rounds, high-quality training bullets. They look real, they feel real, but they have no primer and no powder. That gun won't fire a single shot, even if he pulls the trigger 100 times." "And the video?" I asked. "We have it all," Caleb said. "The rehearsal, the lines, the timing. We'll save it for the anniversary. It'll be the perfect encore for his performance." August 11th, 2024, the eve of the anniversary. The night before the rooftop party, I stood on the balcony of the Thorne penthouse. The air was thick and humid, the city below a churning sea of light and noise. Julian was in the library, probably on his 6th scotch, obsessively checking the von Kessler wire transfer status on his laptop. He was a man waiting for a miracle that was never going to arrive. I looked at my hands. They were steady. For 7 years, my life had been a series of calculations, a long game of chess played against a man who didn't even know he was on the board. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace, and my identity to build this cage. I thought about Maya Brooks. I thought about the way her laughter used to fill our college dorm. I thought about the light in her eyes the day she got the job at Vanguard, before Julian Thorne systematically extinguished it. "Tomorrow, Maya," I whispered into the wind. "Tomorrow, he pays for every second he stole from you." I went inside and laid out the $44 navy dress. I checked the hidden pocket for the satellite phone. I reviewed the final shareholder logs for Vanguard and Sterling. Everything was in place. The Freeloader was ready for her final act. The CEO was ready for her debut. Julian Thorne thought he was throwing a party. He had no idea he was attending his own funeral. The transition from the salt-air breeze of the rooftop to the pressurized, silent atmosphere of the Vanguard and Sterling boardroom felt like diving into deep, cold water. Julian followed me, his steps heavy and uneven. Behind him came Silas Vane, my lead attorney, and Marcus Thorne, Julian's own CEO, along with 11 members of the executive board. They moved like a funeral procession, their faces a mask of confusion and growing dread. Caleb Brooks walked at the rear, his face a marble bust of indifference. The boardroom was a temple of American capitalism. A 30-foot table carved from a single slab of ancient mahogany, walls lined with hand-tooled leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the darkened canyons of Wall Street. Julian slumped into the chair at the head of the table, the one usually reserved for the CEO. He was sweating now, the expensive Macallan turning sour in his system. He looked at me, his eyes darting toward the projection screen at the far end of the room. "Elara, stop this," Julian hissed, his voice cracking. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. You're embarrassing yourself, you're embarrassing us." "Julian," I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the murmurs of the board members as they took their seats. "For 4 years, I have been a ghost in your house. Tonight, I am the only person in this room who is truly awake." I walked to the front of the room and opened a sleek carbon fiber laptop. I didn't look like a struggling writer. I didn't look like a charity case. I looked like the architect of a new world. I tapped a key, and the projection screen flickered to life. VC Ventures, Portfolio Overview. Assets under management, $6.4 billion. Portfolio companies, 52, fintech, biotech, green energy, SaaS. Average annual return, 2014-2024, 24.8%. Founder and CEO, Elara Vance. The room went deathly silent. Marcus, the CEO of Vanguard and Sterling, leaned forward, his spectacles slipping. Down his nose. "What is this, VC Ventures? I've heard of this firm, they're a phantom. Nobody knows who runs it." "I do," I said, meeting his gaze. "I built VC Ventures from a single angel investment 10 years ago. While Julian was busy spending his bonuses on watches and ego, I was quietly acquiring the future. I am the shadow you've been chasing in every major acquisition for the last 3 years." Julian laughed, a high, brittle sound that bordered on hysteria. "This is a joke, a prank. Elara, you clip coupons, you drive a Corolla, you don't have $6 billion. You don't even have $600 in your checking account." "That's because I made sure you only saw what you wanted to see, Julian," I said. "I played the part of the freeloader because it kept you blind. But let's talk about ownership." I clicked the remote. The screen shifted to a complex corporate hierarchy chart. Vanguard and Sterling Equity Breakdown. VC Ventures Holdings, 22%, held through Project Alpha, Beta, and Gamma LLCs. Caleb Brooks Private Trust, 8%. Combined voting stake, 30%. "Gentlemen," I said, turning to the board, "I have spent 3 years vacuuming up every available share of this firm through anonymous holding companies. Together with Caleb's stake, which I financed through a private VC Ventures loan, we are now the largest single voting bloc in this corporation. I don't just work with you, I own you." Julian turned to Caleb, his eyes wide with a betrayal so deep it looked like physical pain. "Caleb, you're with her. I brought you in, I gave you everything." Caleb finally looked at Julian. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold, ancient hunger for justice. "You didn't give me anything, Julian. You stole from my family. You destroyed my sister. For 7 years, every drink we had, every deal we closed, I was just waiting for the moment I could watch you drown." Julian staggered back, his hand catching the edge of the mahogany table. "Your sister? Who? What are you talking about?" "Maya Brooks," I said, the name hitting the room like a gunshot. A photo appeared on the screen. Maya smiling, her MIT graduation cap slightly askew. Below it, a timeline of her destruction. "In 2015, you stole her high-frequency trading algorithm," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You claimed it as your own. You collected a $1 million bonus while you blackmailed her into silence. You ruined her reputation so she could never work again. And on March 15th, 2017, she jumped off the Manhattan Bridge because you had taken every other option away from her." "She was unstable," Julian screamed, his voice echoing off the leather-clad walls. "The firm knows she couldn't handle the pressure." "She handled the pressure fine, Julian," Marcus, the CEO, said unexpectedly. He was looking at the screen, his face pale. "But I remember that algorithm. It was the foundation of our 2016 growth. You told us you'd spent 2 years developing it." "He lied," Caleb said. "And I have the original source code, timestamped from Maya's university servers, along with the logs showing Julian's unauthorized access to her private drive. It's all been turned over to the SEC." Julian collapsed into his chair, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. But I wasn't finished. "Now, let's talk about the Hans von Kessler deal," I said. Julian's head snapped up. No. Hans is real. He's in Zurich. He's moving 100 million. I pressed a button on my laptop. A video feed appeared. It showed me, 6 months ago, sitting in my home office with a headset on. On the second screen, the AI voice synthesis software was active. "Mr. Thorne, this is Hans von Kessler calling from Zurich." The AI voice boomed through the boardroom speakers. Julian watched the video, his mouth hanging open. He watched me type responses. He watched the AI speak them in that gravelly Zurich accent he had grown to worship. "There is no Hans von Kessler, Julian," I said. "I created him. I rented the office. I hired the receptionist. I planted the articles in Bloomberg. Every time you spoke to Hans, you were speaking to me. Every time you confessed to off-book opportunities to impress him, you were talking to a digital recording that went straight to the FBI." "The client money," Marcus whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "Julian, what did you do?" "He moved $8 million, I said, clicking to a slide showing wire transfer logs. "He embezzled it from 3 of your top-tier client accounts, the Henderson Trust, the Miller Estate, and the Rayburn Fund. He moved the money into what he thought was a private Hans von Kessler acquisition vehicle. In reality, that money is sitting in a frozen VC Ventures escrow account, waiting to be returned to the victims." Marcus turned to Julian, his face a mask of cold, corporate fury. "You stole from the Hendersons. Julian, you've just ended this firm." "Not yet," I said, "because as the majority shareholder, I'm prepared to provide a $50 million liquidity injection to stabilize the firm, provided Julian is removed immediately and the board agrees to my restructuring terms." The board members began whispering frantically. The loyalty in the room was shifting with the speed of a high-frequency trade. Julian was no longer a senior VP. He was a liability. He was a virus they needed to excise. "And finally," I said, looking directly at Julian, "let's talk about your debt." The screen shifted one last time. Julian Thorne, personal debt profile. Total outstanding debt, $28,400,000. Creditor, VC Ventures, purchase 2021-2024. Current status, default. "I own your gambling debts, Julian," I said. "I own your mortgage. I own your credit card notes. I bought them all for pennies on the dollar over the last 3 years. As of 10 minutes ago, I have filed for an immediate seizure of all collateral. That means the penthouse, the cars, the watches, they're mine." "The prenup," Julian stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. "The prenup protects my Vanguard equity." "Paragraph 4, subsection 12, Silas Vane, my attorney, said, speaking for the first time. "The liquidated damages for material fraud clause. It states that in the event of criminal activity or financial fraud committed during the marriage, the non-breaching spouse is entitled to 100% of all marital assets, including equity." "Julian, you signed it without reading it because you were too busy laughing at Elara's small inheritance." Julian looked around the room. He looked at the men he had boasted to. He looked at the board that was already drafting his termination papers. He looked at Caleb, the brother who had been a spy for 7 years. He was a man who had been stripped bare in the cold light of the truth. "I'd rather die," Julian whispered, his hand drifting toward his jacket pocket. "I'd rather die than lose everything." The room froze. Silas Vane reached for his phone. Marcus stood up, his hands raised. Julian pulled the Smith and Wesson from his pocket. He pressed the barrel to his temple, his hand shaking so violently the metal clattered against his skull. "Julian, don't," Marcus shouted. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I just looked at him with a weary, profound disappointment. "Pull the trigger, Julian," I said. "Elara, no," Silas hissed. "It's okay, Silas," I said, my voice calm. "Go ahead, Julian, pull the trigger, do it for the cameras, do it for the drama, but we both know you won't, because you're not a martyr, you're just a fraud." Julian's finger tightened on the trigger. The board members ducked. Click. The sound of the firing pin, hitting a dummy round echoed like a thunderclap in the silent room. Julian pulled the trigger again. Click and again. Click, click, click. He looked at the gun, his face contorted with a mix of confusion and pure, unadulterated terror. Caleb swapped the rounds 2 weeks ago, Julian, I said, walking toward him. We've known about your final performance for months. We watched the rehearsal video from your office camera. You practiced the lines. You practiced the angle. You're even failing at being a tragedy. I reached out and took the gun from his limp, shaking hand. I set it on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. The theater is over, Julian, I said. The FBI is in the lobby. And for the first time in your life, you're going to have to face a reality you can't lie your way out of. The doors to the boardroom swung open. Special Agent Sarah Reynolds stepped inside, followed by 4 agents in windbreakers. Julian Thorne, Reynolds said, her voice echoing through the chamber. You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. As the handcuffs snapped shut over Julian's wrists, I didn't feel the rush of triumph I had expected. I just felt the weight of 7 years finally lifting from my shoulders. I looked at the window. The sun was beginning to peek over the Atlantic, a thin ribbon of gold cutting through the Manhattan night. It's morning, Maya, I whispered. To the world, I was a woman who didn't know the difference between a high-yield bond and a grocery coupon. To Julian Thorne, I was a quiet, slightly dim-witted accessory who existed in the periphery of his greatness. But while Julian was busy inflating his ego at Manhattan cocktail parties, I was operating from a command center he didn't even know existed. Located on the 82nd floor of a nondescript steel-end glass tower in the financial district, just 4 blocks away from the Vanguard and Sterling headquarters, was the true heart of my existence. There was no gold lettering on the door, no mahogany reception desk. The suite was registered to a shell entity called Vane Logistics, a name so boring it acted as a natural repellent to the curious. Inside, however, the air hummed with the electric vitality of global commerce. A wall of monitors displayed real-time market data from Tokyo, London, and New York. This was the headquarters of VC Ventures. I remember the day I first walked into this office in 2018, shortly after my pact with Caleb Brooks. I had just liquidated the final remnants of my small inheritance, which was actually a $42 million windfall from an early-stage angel investment in a Silicon Valley fintech startup called Paystream. I had bought in when the founders were working out of a garage in Palo Alto. When they went public, my initial $200,000 had metastasized into a fortune. Julian had never asked where that $42 million went. He was too busy looking at his own reflection. I had moved the capital through a series of offshore accounts in the Cook Islands, eventually settling it into the foundation of VC Ventures. The key to a shadow empire isn't just silence, I told my small, hand-picked team of analysts that first morning. It's being so ubiquitous that you become invisible. We aren't going to be a loud predator. We're going to be the atmosphere. Over the next 5 years, I lived a double life that would have fractured a lesser mind. In the mornings, I was the meek little thing in the $44 dress, making Julian's organic green juice and listening to him moan about his stressful day ahead. I would watch him leave the penthouse, his custom Italian leather shoes clicking arrogantly against the marble, and the moment the elevator doors closed, the mask would drop. I would shed the cheap cardigan and the thrift store flats. I would change into a charcoal gray power suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, uncompromising bun. I would slip out the service entrance of the building, where a black town car with tinted windows, leased by a shell company Julian could never track, would be waiting to whisk me to the 82nd floor. From 9:00 a.m. to 4:00 p.m., I was the financial sniper of Manhattan. My portfolio wasn't built on the kind of pump and dump schemes Julian favored at Vanguard. I invested in substance. I bought a 14% stake in Viridian Bio, a company developing a revolutionary non-invasive glucose monitor. I acquired Ian Power, a startup that had perfected a solid-state battery for long-haul electric trucking. I moved into SaaS, software as a service platforms that managed the back-end logistics for half the Fortune 500. By 2021, VC Ventures was managing $3.8 billion. By 2023, that number had surged to $6.4 billion. But as the empire grew, so did the danger. Julian was a predator, and predators have a sixth sense for movement in the tall grass. To keep him off the scent, I had to lean harder into the freeloader persona. I remember one evening in late 2021. Julian had just returned from a disastrous meeting with a major sovereign wealth fund that had laughed at his proposed fee structure. He was in a foul mood, looking for a target to vent his frustration on. I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously cutting out coupons for laundry detergent and cereal. I had a calculator next to me, and I was frowning at a grocery budget spreadsheet I deliberately left open on my laptop. "For God's sake, Elara," Julian snapped, grabbing a coupon for 50 cents off paper towels and ripping it in half. "You're embarrassing me. What if one of the partners saw you doing this? We live in a $10 million penthouse, and you're worrying about 50 cents. "Every little bit helps, Julian," I said, my voice trembling with practiced insecurity. "I just don't want to be a burden. I know how hard you work for our money." "Our money," he laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "It's my money, Elara. You just live in the glow of it. Try to remember that the next time you think you're being frugal. It makes you look desperate, and by extension, it makes me look cheap." "I'm sorry," I whispered, hanging my head. Inside, I was calculating the quarterly returns for Ian Power. They were up 18%. I had just made $114 million while he was yelling about a 50-cent coupon. The irony was a delicious, cold wine I drank in the silence of my own mind. Maintaining the shadow empire required a level of logistical discipline that bordered on the obsessive. My tax filings were a masterpiece of legal obfuscation. Because Julian had signed that sentimental reasons amendment back in 2020, he never saw the real Elara Vance on paper. My attorney, Silas Vane, handled the official Elara, the one who earned a meager $45,000 a year from freelance writing and consulting. That Elara paid her taxes, filed her 1040, and looked perfectly ordinary to the IRS. The other Elara, the CEO of VC Ventures, filed through a complex network of corporate entities. Her name never appeared on a single SEC filing. She was the controlling member of North Star Holdings, which owned Vanguard Equity Group LLC, which in turn owned the 22% stake in Vanguard and Sterling. Caleb Brooks was my eyes and ears on the inside of Julian's bank. We met once a week, always in locations that were deliberately un-Manhattan, a dive bar in Queens, a public library in the Bronx, a freezing bench on the Coney Island boardwalk in the middle of February. "He's getting sloppy, Elara," Caleb told me during one of those meetings in 2022. We were sitting in a parked car in a supermarket lot in Staten Island, the rain drumming against the roof. "The gambling debts are mounting. He's taking out private loans now to cover his markers at the Wynn. He thinks he can trade his way out of it, but he's losing his edge. He's impulsive." "Is he dipping into client funds yet?" I asked. "Not yet," Caleb said, "but he's looking at the Thorne Scholars Fund like a starving man looks at a steak. He's already shifted some of the marketing budget into a personal account in the Caymans. It's small, 50 grand here, 100 there, but it's a start. The pattern is forming." "Good," I said, staring through the windshield at the gray, rain-slicked asphalt. "Let him get comfortable. Let him think he's a genius for getting away with it." Caleb looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. "Sometimes I look at you, Elara, and I don't see the girl I knew in college. I don't see the woman who used to bake cookies with Maya. I see something else." "Maya is dead, Caleb," I said, my voice flat. "And the woman who baked cookies died with her on that bridge. Julian Thorne didn't just kill her. He forced me to become the only thing that could stop him. I am a creature of his own making." "Just don't lose yourself in the process," Caleb whispered. "I lost myself a long time ago," I replied. "Now I'm just a project, and unlike Julian's charity, this project is going to be finished. By late 2023, the $6.4 billion empire was a fully operational war machine. I had spent 7 years positioning the pieces, and the board was now set. But the most delicate part of the empire of shadows wasn't the money or the shell companies. It was the psychological toll of living with the enemy. For 4 years, I had shared a bed with the man who had driven my best friend to her death. I had felt his touch, listened to his breathing in the dark, and sat across from him at breakfast every single morning. I had learned to compartmentalize my soul. I had a mental vault where I stored my hatred. I would walk into the penthouse, see his smug, arrogant face, and I would lock the rage behind a steel door in my mind. I would smile. I would ask about his day. I would play the role of the grateful wife with a performance that would have won an Oscar. But at night, while Julian slept the heavy, drunken sleep of a man who thought he was untouchable, I would lie awake and count the days. I would think about the 22% stake in his firm. I would think about the $28 million in debt notes I held in my safe. I would think about the Hans von Kessler files. Julian Thorne thought he was the architect of his own destiny. He thought he was the king of the Manhattan skyline. He didn't realize that the very air he breathed was owned by me. He didn't realize that every win he had over the last 3 years had been a gift I had allowed him to have, just to make his eventual fall more catastrophic. I remember the morning of the 4th anniversary. Julian was in the bathroom, shouting about his favorite cufflinks being missing. I was standing in the kitchen, making his coffee, wearing an old robe I'd bought at a garage sale for $3. Elara, where the hell are the gold ones? The ones Silas gave me. I think they're in the jewelry box on your dresser, Julian, I shouted back, my voice pitched in that helpful, subservient tone I'd perfected. I looked at the coffee cup. It was a simple white mug. I thought about the rooftop party that was coming. I thought about the $44 dress hanging in the closet. I thought about the 150 guests who would soon be laughing at me. And I felt a sudden, sharp burst of joy. Julian Thorne was about to find out that the dead weight he'd been complaining about for 4 years wasn't an anchor. It was a bomb, and the timer was about to hit 0. "This is for Maya," I whispered to the steam rising from the mug. "And this is for this channel, where the truth finally gets told." I picked up the coffee and walked into the bedroom, a smile on my face that Julian, in his blind, beautiful arrogance, would mistake for love. The birth of a billionaire is usually a decades-long labor of sweat, blood, and compounding interest. But for Hans von Kessler, it took 18 months of meticulous digital engineering and $250,000 in untraceable capital. I sat in my office at the penthouse, a cramped corner of the guest room Julian called the hobby nook, surrounded by stacks of dusty books and a vintage typewriter I used as a prop. To Julian, I was a failing writer chasing a dream that would never materialize. He would walk past the door, see me staring out the window with a look of feigned artistic frustration, and he would smirk. Still on Chapter O. "Nee, babe. Maybe try writing about something you know, like how to find the best deals on canned soup." I would offer a shy, wounded smile, tucking a stray hair behind my ear. "I'm trying, Julian, it's just, the character development is hard." He had no idea that while he was at Vanguard and Sterling, I was developing the most complex character of the century. I wasn't writing a novel, I was writing Julian's obituary. Hans von Kessler was designed to be the ultimate bait for a man of Julian's specific insecurities. Julian was new money, loud, flashy, and desperate for the validation of the old-world establishment. He worshipped the idea of the shadow titans, the European aristocrats who moved billions with a whisper while staying entirely off the social radar. Hans was that whisper. The architecture of a ghost. The infrastructure of Hans von Kessler began with a minimalist website, von Kessler Capital, CH. I didn't want a flashy site. I wanted a digital fortress that screamed exclusive. I hired a Zurich-based web developer, paying him through a VC Ventures shell company in the British Virgin Islands. The site was hosted on secure Swiss servers, and its landing page was just a simple, elegant logo and a login portal for private clients. There was no About Us page. There were no stock photos of people shaking hands. Hans didn't need to sell himself. I spent 6 months planting the legend. I paid for sponsored, high-end content in the Financial Times and Bloomberg, enigmatic profiles that spoke of a Swiss investor who had quietly dominated the Asian tech markets. The Paradeplatz Phantom, one article called him. How Hans von Kessler stays ahead of the curve. These weren't ads, they were native advertising, designed to look like editorial pieces. I knew Julian's morning routine included scanning these specific outlets. I was seeding his subconscious long before I ever made a call. Next came the physical presence. I rented a serviced office at Paradeplatz 8 in the heart of Zurich's financial district. The building was a limestone monument to stability, located just a 5-minute walk from the headquarters of UBS and Credit Suisse. The office came with a virtual receptionist named Anna, a woman who worked for a high-end management company and was paid to answer calls for a dozen different firms. She had no idea she was the gatekeeper for a ghost. Von Kessler Capital AG, how may I direct your call? Her voice was the sound of cold, Swiss efficiency. For the visual, I used a high-end AI composite generator to create Hans's face. I didn't want a real person Julian could accidentally run into at a gala. I wanted a face that was a composite of European authority. Silver hair, sharp cheekbones, a look of perpetual, dignified boredom. I bought an aged LinkedIn account with 500-plus connections and had the profile endorsed by other purchased accounts for venture capital and strategic investments. The final and most vital element was the voice. I hired a Swiss voice actor to record thousands of phonemes and phrases in a gravelly, authoritative Zurich accent. I then fed those recordings into a state-of-the-art AI voice synthesis software. This allowed me to type responses into a text box in real time during a call. The software would then translate my text into Hans's voice with a 2-second latency that sounded like a slight transatlantic delay. To Julian, it would be a live phone call from a billionaire. To me, it was a high-stakes video game. June 15, 2023, the first contact. I checked the clock, 10:45 a.m. Caleb had just texted me. He's at his desk. He's stressed about the Q2 numbers. He's ripe. I took a deep breath, smoothing the scratchy $44 Ross dress I was wearing. The juxtaposition was jarring, sitting in a cheap dress in a fake office, about to deploy a multi-million-dollar digital con. I pulled the headset over my ears and dialed Julian's private line through a VoIP server in Manhattan, ensuring the recording would be legal under New York's one-party consent law. The phone rang twice. "Julian Thorne," he snapped, his voice tight with the pressure of a failing quarter. I typed, "Mr. Thorne, this is Hans von Kessler calling from Zurich. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The AI spoke. The gravelly, Swiss lilt was perfect. I watched the waveform on my screen as Julian's breathing hitched. "Mr. von Kessler," Julian's tone shifted instantly. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a desperate, fawning subservience. "Not at all. I've heard quite a bit about your work in the Singapore markets. What can I do for you?" I typed, "I've been following your work at Vanguard and Sterling, Julian. Your colleague, Caleb Brooks, spoke highly of your appetite for risk. I am looking to deploy $50 million into the U.S. market, but I require a partner with discretion." "Discretion is my middle name, Hans," Julian said, leaning into the phone. I could almost see him adjusting his tie, preening for a man who didn't exist. $50 million is a significant stake. We can set up a video conference for tomorrow morning to discuss the allocation. I typed, "No video, Julian. My clients demand absolute anonymity. I do not do video calls, and I do not meet in person until after the first $50 million is deployed and performing. If that is a problem for you, I have other options in the Manhattan market." The scarcity play. I knew Julian's psyche. He couldn't stand the thought of being rejected by the elite. No, Julian said quickly. "I understand completely. Privacy is the ultimate luxury. Tell me, what kind of structure are you looking for?" "I am looking for off-book opportunities, Julian. High-yield, private placement deals. The kind of returns that Vanguard's board doesn't necessarily need to be aware of. Do you have the nerve for that?" There was a long silence. I could hear the faint hum of Julian's office air conditioning. "I have exactly the nerve you're looking for, Hans," Julian whispered. "Let's talk again on Friday." The hook and the sink. Over the next few weeks, the Hans von Kessler persona became Julian's obsession. Caleb reported that Julian was spending hours researching Zurich banking laws and Swiss tax structures. He was a man who thought he had finally found his equal, a mentor who could lead him into the true upper echelons of global power. To solidify the illusion, Caleb met Julian for lunch at a steakhouse in the Loop. Caleb accidentally left a folder open on the table. Inside was a fabricated wire transfer receipt, a photoshopped document showing a $5 million transfer from the Brooks Family Trust to Von Kessler Capital AG. "You're in with him, Caleb?" Julian had asked, his voice trembling with envy. "I've moved a small stake, Julian," Caleb said, feigning a casual indifference. "Hans is tough. He's old school, but his returns are unparalleled. He's the only reason I was able to cover my losses on that biotech short last year." Julian was hooked. He began calling Hans 3 times a week. Each call was a step deeper into the trap. I would dangle the $50 million carrot, then yank it away with Swiss regulatory delays or compliance reviews. It made Julian desperate. It made him reckless. By July, Julian was drowning in gambling debts. His bookies in Vegas were losing patience, and his offshore markers were being called in. He needed a big win to cover the holes in his personal accounts before the Vanguard auditors did their annual sweep. Hans von Kessler offered him the lifeline. "Julian," I typed during a late-night call in August, "I'm prepared to move, but I need to see your creative bookkeeping. I want to see how you move capital when the firm isn't looking. Show me your nerve and the 50 million becomes 100 million. "I've already done it, Hans," Julian confessed, his voice thick with the high of his own perceived genius. "I moved 8 million this morning. SHF did it from the Henderson and Rayburn client accounts into a Delaware shell I control. It's a temporary loan for a high-yield bridge deal. I'll have it back before the quarter ends, and no one will ever know. I can send you the logs." I felt a cold shiver of triumph. Embezzlement, on a recorded line. "Send them, Julian," Hans said. "If the logs are sound, the 100 million wires on Monday." Julian sent the logs. He sent the account numbers. He sent the forged authorization letters he'd used to trick the Vanguard compliance officers. He handed me his life on a silver platter, all because he wanted the approval of a Swiss ghost. As I hung up the phone that night, I looked at the $44 dress in the mirror. I looked at the typewriter. Julian Thorne was a senior VP at one of the most powerful banks in the world, and he had just been outplayed by a charity case in a guest room. The Hans von Kessler gambit was over. Now, it was time for the rooftop. The Manhattan night was never truly dark, but in the library of the Thorne penthouse, the shadows felt thick enough to touch. It was 3:14 a.m., and the only light came from the blue, ghostly glow of Julian's laptop screen and the rhythmic amber pulse of a half-empty bottle of Macallan 25 reflecting the city lights. Julian Thorne was a man of impeccable surfaces, but the bedrock beneath him was liquefying. I stood in the darkened hallway, a ghost in a frayed cotton nightgown, watching him through the crack in the heavy oak door. He didn't see me. He didn't see anything except the numbers dancing on his screen, the jagged, downward-trending lines of an offshore sportsbook account that was hemorrhaging his remaining liquidity. "Damn it," Julian hissed, his voice a jagged rasp. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, making the crystal tumbler rattle. "One bad beat, that's all it is, just one bad beat." I watched as he refreshed the page, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. To the world, Julian Thorne was the architect of the Vanguard and Sterling success story. To the private investigator I had paid $200,000 to shadow him for 3 years, he was a functioning degenerate. Julian's addiction wasn't just to money, it was to the high-voltage electricity of the risk. He didn't just bet on games, he bet on his own perceived invincibility. By the spring of 2024, Julian's secret life was a house of cards in a hurricane. According to the deep-dive financial reports I reviewed at my VC Ventures office, he owed $2.4 million to a high-stakes gambling syndicate in Las Vegas and another $1.8 million to offshore sportsbooks in Antigua. But that was just the surface. He had taken out $12 million in unsecured personal loans from private, high-interest lenders, men who didn't care about his Thorne pedigree and only cared about the VIG. Julian thought he had a safety net. He thought that if the world finally crashed down, he could simply liquidate his mother's Scarsdale estate. He viewed Beatrice's $4.2 million as his emergency brake. He didn't know I had already cut the line. The descent began in earnest when Julian realized that Hans von Kessler deal was his only path to salvation. The pressure I applied through the Swiss persona was surgical. Every time Hans dangled the $50 million, or later, the $100 million, he required Julian to prove his nerve. "Mr. Thorne," I had typed through the AI synthesis software just 48 hours prior, "Zurich doesn't invest in conventional men. We invest in predators who know how to move capital when the regulatory lights are dim. Show me you are a wolf, not a sheep, and the 100 million wires on Monday." Julian was cornered. His Vegas contact, a man named Vinny who spoke in the low, flat tones of a debt collector who never had to raise his voice, had called Julian's private cell yesterday morning. "Julian," Vinny had said, "the house is losing patience. 3 million in markers is a lot of weight to carry. We'd hate for your board at Vanguard to find out that their senior VP is a credit risk. Or worse, we'd hate for you to have an accident on your way to the Hamptons this weekend. Pay by Friday." Julian had hung up, his hands shaking so violently he'd dropped his phone. The narcissist's mind is a fascinating machine. It cannot accept fault, so it invents a bridge. Julian didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a creative financier who was temporarily borrowing capital to bridge the gap until the von Kessler windfall arrived. The embezzlement. On the morning of April 15th, Julian sat in his glass-walled office at Vanguard and Sterling, the shadows under his eyes heavy despite the expensive concealer he'd started using. He pulled up the internal ledger for 3 of the firm's most prestigious legacy accounts: the Henderson Trust, the Miller Estate, and the Rayburn Fund. These were accounts that had been with the bank for decades, managed by families who trusted the Thorne name implicitly. They were slow accounts managed for long-term growth, rarely audited by the clients themselves. They were the perfect targets. I watched through the hidden camera Caleb had installed in the smoke detector. I saw Julian's fingers hover over the keyboard. I saw the sweat on his upper lip. He wasn't thinking about the Rayburns or the Hendersons. He was thinking about Vinny. He was thinking about Hans. He was thinking about the $100 million lifeline that was just one nerve test away. With a series of rapid keystrokes, Julian initiated 3 separate wire transfers totaling $8.4 million. He didn't send them directly to his gambling accounts. He was smarter than that, or so he thought. He routed the funds through a Delaware shell company he'd set up 6 months prior, Apex Global Strategic Partners. From there, the money was funneled into a private placement vehicle he'd claimed was for the von Kessler acquisition. Within minutes, $8.4 million of client money had vanished from Vanguard and Sterling's audited accounts. He then pulled up a series of templates on his screen. I watched as he expertly forged the authorization letters, digitally duplicating the signatures of James Henderson and Elara Rayburn. He was meticulous, his breathing slowing down as the work took over. This was the Julian Thorne the world admired, the man who could solve any problem with a bit of creative structuring. Once the files were sent, Julian leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked up at the ceiling, right into the lens of the camera he didn't know was there. He offered a small, arrogant smirk. He thought he'd done it. He thought he'd cheated the Reaper one more time. The final hook. 10 minutes later, my secure satellite phone buzzed in the writing nook at the penthouse. It was the Hans von Kessler alert. I pulled the headset on. I didn't even have to look at the logs to know what he'd done. I'd watched him do it in real time. "Julian," I typed. The AI spoke in its gravelly. Swiss lilt. I see the activity in the Delaware vehicle. You move with the speed of a man who knows his worth. I am impressed. The Zurich board has approved the $100 million stake. I told you, Hans, Julian said, his voice brimming with a sickening, newfound confidence. I don't play by the same rules as the rest of these suits. I get things done. When can I expect the wire? Monday morning, Julian, but discretion is paramount. I want no record of this in your official Vanguard reports until the merger is finalized. Do we have an understanding? Absolutely, Hans. My lips are sealed. We're going to change the face of Wall Street together. I hung up. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. He had just stolen the life savings and trusts of 3 families, money meant for grandchildren's educations and charitable legacies, just to pay off a bookie and impress a ghost. I turned to my second monitor, where the VC Ventures dashboard was open. Silas, I said, calling my attorney. Julian just moved the $8.4 million. The wire logs are in the Hans von Kessler inbox. Forward them to Special Agent Reynolds immediately. And Silas. Yes, Elara. Prepare the notice of default for his personal debts. The moment the FBI moves in on the anniversary, I want every single loan he owes VC Ventures called in. I want him to find out he's bankrupt at the exact same moment he finds out he's a felon. Understood. We're ready on this end. I walked out of the nook and into the kitchen. Julian was coming home early, his step lighter than it had been in weeks. He burst through the door, clutching a bag from a high-end jeweler on Fifth Avenue. Elara, babes, come here. I walked over, my face a mask of shy, grateful confusion. Julian, what's going on? You're home so early. I had a great day at the office, Elara, a career-defining day. He reached into the bag and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a diamond bracelet, at least 5 carats, sparkling with a cold blue light. Happy early anniversary. I know I've been stressed lately, but things are turning around. Big time. I looked at the bracelet. I knew exactly whose money had paid for it. It was the Miller family's retirement. It was the Rayburn grandchildren's college fund. It was blood money disguised as a gift. Julian, it's beautiful, I whispered, my voice thick with a genuine emotion he mistook for joy. But it must have been so expensive. Can we really afford this? Julian laughed, a booming, arrogant sound that filled the penthouse. He draped the bracelet over my wrist, his fingers cold against my skin. Babe, don't you worry about the price tag. I'm Julian Thorne. I make the world go round. From now on, we're only buying the best. I looked down at the diamonds. They felt like handcuffs. Thank you, Julian, I said, looking up at him with a smile that had taken me 7 years to perfect. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd be back at Ross clipping coupons, he joked, patting my cheek. But don't worry, I'm never letting that happen. You're with me now, and with Julian Thorne, the party never ends. No, Julian, I thought as he walked toward the library to pour himself a celebratory drink. The party doesn't end. It just moves to a courtroom. I walked to the master bathroom and scrubbed my wrist where he'd touched me. The descent was complete. Julian was now a common thief, a fraudulent philanthropist, and a man who owed $28 million to a woman he'd spent 4 years mocking. The stage was set for the rooftop. The Celestial Terrace was waiting, and so was Maya Brooks. The Celestial Terrace had been a scene of glittering cruelty, but the air inside the Vanguard and Sterling Boardroom was sterile, cold, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and impending doom. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut and the electronic lock engaged with a definitive mechanical thud, Julian Thorne swayed on his feet. He was still clutching a half-empty glass of scotch, his face a mask of drunken bewilderment that was rapidly curdling into terror. Elara, stop this charade, Julian roared, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was the sound of a man shouting into a canyon, hoping for an echo that wouldn't come. You're making a scene in front of my board. You're humiliating yourself. I didn't answer him. I walked to the head of the massive mahogany table, the $44 navy dress feeling like a suit of armor. I opened my laptop and connected it to the massive 90-inch 4K monitor that dominated the far wall. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with a practiced, CEO-level authority that made the 12 board members, men who had spent their lives commanding markets, sit up straighter. "Thank you for joining us. I know this isn't the anniversary celebration you expected, but I believe you'll find the next 10 minutes far more enlightening than any toast." Marcus Silas, the silver-haired CEO of Vanguard and Sterling, leaned forward, his hands folded. He looked at me with a sharp, analytical gaze. "Mrs. Thorne, or is it Vance? Your message said this was a matter of urgent fiduciary concern. Explain yourself." "Fiduciary concern?" Julian laughed, a jagged, pathetic sound. "Marcus, she's a freelance writer who doesn't know a P and L from a grocery list. She's having some kind of breakdown. Elara, give me the laptop." He reached for the computer, but Caleb Brooks stepped between us. Caleb didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on Julian's chest and pushed him back into a leather chair. Julian gasped, staring up at the man he thought was his best friend. "Sit down, Julian," Caleb said, his voice as cold as a mountain stream. "The adults are talking." I tapped a key on my laptop. The screen flickered to life. VC Ventures, Portfolio Overview. Total assets under management, $6.4 billion. Active portfolio companies, 52. Founded, 2012. CEO and majority shareholder, Elara Vance. The room went deathly silent. Marcus Silas adjusted his glasses, squinting at the screen. VC Ventures? I've heard this name. They're the ghost firm that outbid us on the Ian Power acquisition last quarter. Nobody knows who owns them. "I do," I said. "Because I built them. I am the shadow you've been chasing for 3 years, Marcus. I started with a $42 million windfall from a fintech exit and built an empire while Julian was busy looking for his favorite cufflinks." Julian stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. This is a prank. It's a deep fake. You don't have $6 billion. You bought that dress at Ross. I saw the receipt." "I bought the dress at Ross so you wouldn't look at me, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "And it worked. You were so busy mocking my frugality that you never bothered to ask why my tax attorney, Silas Vane, is the same man who manages the Vanguard holding companies." I clicked to the next slide. Vanguard and Sterling Equity Ownership. VC Ventures Holdings, via Project Alpha Beta LLCs, 19.2%. Caleb Brooks Private Equity Trust, 8.3%. Combined voting block, 27.5%. "As of tonight," I continued, "Caleb and I control over a quarter of the voting shares in this firm. We are the majority. And under the terms of the Vanguard bylaws, Section 9, we are calling for an immediate emergency session to discuss the removal of Julian Thorne for gross misconduct and material fraud." Julian surged to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "Fraud? What fraud? I'm the top producer in this bank. I brought in the Rayburn Fund. I brought in the Miller estate." "You didn't bring them in, Julian," I said, clicking to the next slide. "You robbed them." The screen filled with wire transfer logs, the ones Julian had sent to Hans von Kessler 48 hours prior. Material Fraud Report, April 15, 2024. The Henderson Trust, $2.8 million embezzled. The Miller Estate, $3.1 million embezzled. The Rayburn Fund, $2.5 million embezzled. Total, $8.04 M funneled to Apex Global Strategic Partners, BVI Shell. You moved $8.4 million of client money into a shell company you control, Julian, I said. You did it to cover your gambling markers in Vegas and to impress a Swiss billionaire who doesn't exist. Julian's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. Hans knows about that. It's a private placement. He approved it. Hans von Kessler is a digital ghost, Julian, I said. I clicked a button, and the making of video began to play. The board watched in stunned silence as the screen showed me in my guest room, wearing a headset, typing into the AI voice synthesis software. They heard my typed words translated into Hans's gravelly, authoritative Zurich accent. "Show me your nerve, Julian." The AI Hans boomed from the boardroom speakers. Julian watched his own destruction on the screen. He saw the woman he'd called a freeloader skillfully manipulating his every greed-fueled impulse. He saw the trap closing around him in high definition. "Every call was recorded, Julian," I said. "Every wire transfer was tracked. And because I own your debt, I've had access to your private ledgers for 3 years." "You own my debt," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Julian Thorne, personal liabilities. Offshore gambling debt, Antigua, $4.02 M. Vegas casino markers, $3.08 M. Private unsecured loans, Jersey, $12.05 M. Credit card/secondary mortgages, $7.9 M. Total, $28.04 M. Purchased by VC Ventures Debt Recovery Group." "I bought your notes for 40 cents on the dollar, Julian," I said. "I am your primary creditor, and as of 10 minutes ago, I have declared you in default. I am seizing the penthouse, the Hamptons house, and every cent in your personal accounts. You don't own the shoes you're standing in." Julian turned to Marcus Silas, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal desperation. "Marcus, help me. This is entrapment. She's my wife. She's doing this to hurt me." Marcus Silas didn't look at Julian. He looked at the embezzled wire logs. "You stole from the Rayburns." "Julian, Elara Rayburn is 92 years old. You stole her great-grandchildren's inheritance to pay a bookie." Marcus looked at the board members. "We have no choice. Julian Thorne is terminated, effective immediately. We cooperate fully with the authorities to save what's left of our reputation." "Wait," Julian screamed, his hand diving into his tuxedo jacket. "I'm not going down like this. I'd rather die than lose everything." The board members gasped, several diving under the table. Julian pulled the Smith & Wesson M and P9 from his pocket. He pressed the cold barrel to his temple, his hand shaking so violently the gun rattled against his skin. "Julian, put it down," Marcus shouted, his voice high with panic. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed. I looked at Julian, and I didn't feel a flicker of fear. I felt a cold, clinical curiosity. "Pull the trigger, Julian," I said. The room went deathly silent. Julian stared at me, his eyes bulging. "What?" "You heard me," I said, walking toward him, ignoring the gun. "Pull the trigger. You've been practicing this for months, haven't you? We watched the rehearsal video from your office, Julian. We saw you practicing the lines. We saw you adjusting the angle in the glass. You called it theater. So go ahead. Give us the final act." Julian's finger tightened on the trigger. He squeezed. Click. The firing pin hit a dummy round with a dull, hollow sound. Julian's eyes went wide. He pulled the trigger again. Click, and again, click, click. "Caleb swapped the rounds for training dummies 2 weeks ago, Julian," I said, reaching out and taking the gun from his limp, useless hand. I set it on the mahogany table. "You can't even manage a tragedy correctly." The boardroom doors burst open. Special Agent Sarah Reynolds led a team of 4 agents into the room. "Julian Thorne," Reynolds said, her voice clear and authoritative. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As the agents hauled Julian out of his chair and snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists, he looked at Caleb Brooks one last time. "Why? Caleb, why would you do this to me?" Caleb leaned in, his face inches from Julian's. "For Maya Brooks, you son of a bitch, remember her now? Because I'm her brother, and I've spent 7 years waiting for this second." Julian's eyes rolled back in his head as the agents perp-walked him out of the room. The King of Manhattan was being dragged out in front of his own board, leaving a trail of expensive scotch and shattered pride on the carpet. I turned to the board. They were staring at me as if I were a ghost that had just materialized in their sanctuary. "Now," I said, smoothing my $44 Ross dress, "let's talk about the Victim Compensation Fund, because we have a lot of work to do to fix the damage Julian Thorne left behind." The heavy mahogany doors to the Vanguard and Sterling boardrooms swung shut behind Julian Thorne, the sound of his scuffed leather shoes fading into the distance as the FBI agents led him toward the service elevator. The room, which had been a theater of high-stakes drama only moments before, fell into a suffocating, pressurized silence. The 12 board members, men who collectively managed more wealth than the GDP of several small nations, sat frozen in their leather chairs. They looked at the empty seat at the head of the table, then at the Smith and Wesson M and P9 lying on the polished wood like a discarded toy, and finally they looked at me. I stood at the front of the room, the $44 navy dress now a stark contrast to the billions of dollars of data still glowing on the 90-inch monitor behind me. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was waiting. Mrs. Thorne, or rather, Ms. Vance, Marcus Silas began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some shred of executive composure. This is a catastrophic breach of trust. The embezzlement from the Rayburn and Miller accounts alone is enough to trigger a federal audit that will dismantle this firm. Why are you telling us this now? Why not just let the FBI handle it in the dark? Because the FBI cares about the crimes, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a diamond-tipped blade. But I care about the people. Julian didn't just steal from your spreadsheets. He stole from children. He stole from families who had nothing but the hope he dangled in front of them. I walked to the boardroom door and turned the lock. And before we discuss the future of Vanguard and Sterling, you are going to look at the faces of the people Julian Thorne destroyed. I tapped a command into my laptop. The screen flickered, shifting away from the wire logs and debt profiles. A photograph appeared, a 19-year-old girl in a graduation cap and gown, her eyes bright with a fierce, untapped intelligence. "This is Elara Rodriguez," I said. 2 years ago, Julian stood on a stage at her high school in T. He Bronx. He gave a rousing speech about the Thorne Scholars Fund. He called Elara the future of biomedical engineering. He handed her a certificate, signed in gold ink, promising a $350,000 full-ride scholarship to Columbia University. I clicked to the next slide. It was a scan of the certificate. It looked official. It had the Thorne family seal. It was a masterpiece of graphic design and utter cruelty. "Elena's mother, Maria, is here tonight," I said. "She's been waiting in the hallway for 3 hours. She's the woman you've walked past a dozen times while she was scrubbing the floors of this very building at 3 in the morning." I opened the door. Maria Rodriguez stepped inside, followed by Elara. Maria's hands were calloused, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a lifetime of double shifts. Elara stood beside her, wearing a faded Columbia sweatshirt, her expression a mix of terror and steely resolve. The board members shifted uncomfortably. These were men who dealt in human capital, but they rarely had to look at the humans themselves. "Tell them, Elara," I said softly. Elara stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "My mother sold our only car. We moved into a 1-bedroom apartment so we could save the rent money for my fees. We borrowed $60,000 from relatives because when I got to orientation, the financial aid office said the Thorne Fund didn't exist. They said no one had ever heard of it." She looked at Marcus Silas. "I'm $80,000 in debt now. I work 3 jobs while carrying 20 credits. My mother has no car to get to her cleaning shifts. Mr. Thorne didn't just lie to us. He broke us. He used my face for a photo op in the Times to raise $10 million, and he didn't give me a single cent." Maria Rodriguez didn't speak. She just looked at the board members with a profound, weary disappointment that seemed to age them by a decade. I clicked the remote again. The THORNE Scholars Fund, the real 990. Total donations raised, 2020-2024, $14.2 million. Scholarships promised, 254 students. Scholarships awarded, 0. Administrative expenses, BVI shells, $13.5 million, $95%. Operating capital remaining, $700,000. "The money didn't go to tuition," I said, my voice echoing in the silent boardroom. It went to Global Educational Management, LLC, a shell company Julian controlled in the British Virgin Islands. From there, it was funneled into his gambling accounts in Antigua and used to pay for the philanthropy galas, where he raised even more money from well-meaning donors. I looked at Silas Vane, my attorney, who stood by the door. Silas, tell them about the legal status. We have already filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 212 families, Silas said. We have the documentation for every single promise Julian Thorne made and every single dollar he diverted. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division is already processing the 501 C3 fraud charges. This isn't just a civil matter anymore. It's a systemic federal crime. Marcus Silas rubbed his temples. 25 million, he whispered. That's what it will take to make these families whole. We don't have that kind of liquidity, Ms. Vance. Not with the FBI freezing our primary trading accounts tomorrow morning. I know you don't, I said, walking back to my laptop. But VC Ventures does. I clicked to the final slide of the night. The settlement proposal. VC Ventures capital injection. $50 million, immediate. Purpose, victim restitution and firm stabilization. Conditions. 1. Immediate establishment of the Maya Brooks Memorial Scholarship Fund, fully funded. 2. Restitution for all 254 Thorne scholar families, tuition plus interest plus damages. 3. A seat on the Vanguard and Sterling Board of Directors for Elara Vance. 4. Caleb Brooks appointed as interim head of compliance. The board members looked at each other. They were drowning, and I was throwing them a life raft, one that came with a very heavy chain. You're asking us to hand you the keys to the firm, one of the board members said, a man named Richard who had been Julian's biggest supporter. I already own the keys, Richard, I said, pointing to the 22% stake on the screen. I'm just giving you the opportunity to stay in the house. You have 60 seconds to decide. If you refuse, I withdraw the capital. I release the Hans von Kessler tapes to the Wall Street Journal tonight, and Vanguard and Sterling is bankrupt by the time the markets open tomorrow. Marcus Silas looked at Alina and Maria Rodriguez. He looked at the gun on the table. He looked at the woman in the $44 dress who had just outmaneuvered every genius in the room. Call the vote, Marcus said, his voice hollow. 12 hands went up, every single one. It's decided, Marcus whispered. 50 million. The board seat is yours. The restitution begins tonight. I turned to Maria and Alina. Your debt is gone, I said, and the car will be in your driveway by tomorrow. Afternoon. I'm so sorry it took this long. Maria Rodriguez walked over to me. She didn't say a word. She simply took my hand and squeezed it. Her grip was like iron, the grip of a woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her. As they left the room, Marcus Silas stood up. The FBI will be back in the morning, Ms. Vance. What do we tell the press? You tell them the truth, I said, packing up my laptop. You tell them that Julian Thorne was a cancer and he's been excised. You tell them that Vanguard and Sterling is under new management. And Marcus. Yes. I want that gun off the table. It's a fake, just like the man who carried it. From now on, in this room, we only deal in reality. I walked out of the boardroom, Caleb following close behind. The hallways of Vanguard and Sterling were empty now, the gold-leafed walls feeling cold and hollow. You did it, Elara, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. You really did it. Not yet, Caleb, I said, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. We have one more performance to finish. We have to show the world the rehearsal video. The sun rose over the jagged teeth of the Manhattan skyline on August 13th, 2024. But for Julian Thorne, the world had already gone dark. I stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the residence that was now legally mine in its entirety, and watched the first light of dawn hit the glass of the One World Trade Center. The air was cool for an August morning, carrying the faint, salty scent of the Atlantic. I held a lukewarm cup of black coffee in my hands, wearing a silk robe that felt heavy and real, unlike the frayed cotton disguises of the last 4 years. The silence of the apartment was profound. For 48 months, This space had been a theater of war, every word a tactical move, every silence a calculated risk. Now the enemy was gone. Perp walked out of a boardroom in front of the very men he had spent a decade trying to impress. By 7:00 a.m., the media explosion was a wildfire that no PR firm on earth could contain. I sat at the marble kitchen island and watched the notifications scroll across my tablet like a digital avalanche. The New York Times: billionaire wife exposes husband's $28 million fraud scheme at anniversary gala. The Wall Street Journal: Vanguard and Sterling executive arrested on RICO charges. Hidden wife reveals secret multi-billion-dollar empire. Forbes: meet Elara Vance, the ghost CEO who built a 6.4B portfolio while living as a charity case. The story was too perfect for the news cycle to ignore. It had everything: betrayal, secret identities, old money, and a cinematic downfall. But the real killing blow didn't come from the headlines. It came from the video Caleb and I released to the federal prosecutors and subsequently to the public. The rehearsal video went viral by noon. The grainy, high-definition footage showed Julian Thorne in his private office at 11:47 p.m. on a random Tuesday in February. It showed him standing before his own reflection, pointing a Smith & Wesson at his temple. But it wasn't a suicide attempt. It was a practice run. The world watched as Julian Thorne, the golden boy of Wall Street, rehearsed his fake despair. They heard him testing different inflections of the line, "I'd rather die than lose everything." They saw him adjust his facial expression in the darkened glass, timing the dramatic beat for maximum manipulation. In that moment, any lingering sympathy for Julian Thorne evaporated. He wasn't a tragic figure driven to the edge. He was a narcissist who viewed even his own death as a marketing strategy. November 18, 2024, the sentencing. The courtroom at the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York was a sterile chamber of white walls and fluorescent light. I sat in the second row, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, my hands folded in my lap. Caleb Brooks sat beside me, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the man in the orange jumpsuit. Julian looked 20 years older than he had on the night of the anniversary. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and the arrogant tilt of his chin was replaced by a hollow, sunken-eyed stare. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anyone. The magistrate judge read the charges with a rhythmic, devastating finality. Counts 123, wire fraud. Count 24, conspiracy to commit racketeering, RICO. Counts 2536, mail fraud. Counts 3743, tax evasion and charity fraud. 43 federal counts, a theoretical maximum of 120 years in prison. The assistant U.S. attorney, David Walsh, the man Silas and I had worked with for 3 years, rose from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, the United States opposes any form of leniency. Mr. Thorne didn't just steal money, he stole futures. He targeted the vulnerable, using his family name as a weapon to defraud 254 families through a fraudulent scholarship fund. He embezzled millions from legacy trusts to cover gambling markers. And when the walls closed in, he attempted to manipulate the court and his family with a choreographed suicide threat. He is a predator in every sense of the word." Julian's public defender, a woman who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else, leaned into the microphone. "Not guilty, Your Honor. We request bail pending trial." The judge didn't even blink. Bail is denied. Mr. Thorne presents a substantial flight risk, given his history of offshore accounts and his lack of any remaining ties to the community. He will remain in federal custody until the conclusion of the trial. 3 days later, Julian accepted a plea deal: 18 years in a federal penitentiary in exchange for full cooperation and asset forfeiture. It was the only way he could avoid dying in a cage. The aftermath. As the doors of the federal van closed on Julian, the work of VC Ventures shifted from destruction to restoration. With my 22% stake and the $50 million liquidity injection, I took my seat on the Vanguard and Sterling board. The firm was rebranded as Vance and Sterling. We implemented new compliance protocols that were the strictest on Wall Street. Every cent Julian had embezzled from the Henderson, Miller, and Rayburn accounts was returned within 30 days, with interest paid from my own personal liquidity. But the most important project was the Maya Brooks Memorial Scholarship Fund. I personally oversaw the restitution of all 254 families Julian had defrauded. Elena Rodriguez was the first recipient. We didn't just pay her tuition, we cleared her mother's debts, replaced their car, and established a $500,000 endowment for Elena's future research in biomedical engineering. I remember the day Elena graduated from Columbia in May 2025. I stood in the audience, away from the cameras, watching her cross that stage. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a giant. She looked at me from the podium and mouthed the words, "Thank you." I didn't need the cameras. I didn't need the headlines. That moment was the only dividend I cared about. December 2025, the final loose end. I sat in my new office on the 102nd floor of the Willis Tower. It was a space of glass and light, looking out over the city I had conquered. On my desk sat a framed photograph of Maya Brooks from our graduation day. She was laughing, her cap tilted back, her eyes full of the future she never got to see. My assistant entered, setting a manila envelope on my desk. "This arrived this morning, Ms. Vance, from FCI Sandstone." Sandstone, the federal prison in Minnesota where Julian was serving his sentence. I stared at the envelope for a long time. I almost shredded it without opening it, but a quiet, cold curiosity won out. I slid a silver letter opener under the flap and pulled out 2 handwritten pages. "Elara," the letter began. The handwriting was shaky, stripped of the bold arrogance it once carried. "I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to care. But I sit in this cell every night and I think about the look in your eyes that night in the boardroom. I think about Maya. I think about the fact that for 4 years, I slept next to the only person who truly understood what I was. I told myself I was a lion, Elara, but a lion doesn't steal from children. A lion doesn't practice his own death in a window. I'm